She was called the greatest ship ever built, yet in one freezing night, Titanic vanished beneath the Atlantic. But what really happened that night, and what did the world get wrong? This is the untold story of Titanic. There are disasters that become headlines. There are disasters that become history. And then there are disasters that become something much larger, stories so powerful that more than a century later, people still ask the same question. How could a ship this large, this advanced, and this confident in its own safety disappear beneath the Atlantic in a single night? On April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic left Southampton, England, bound for New York. She was not simply another passenger ship. Titanic represented the confidence of an age that believed technology was steadily conquering the limits of nature. She was enormous, luxurious, technologically advanced, and built for the most demanding passengers of her time. To the people watching her depart, there was little reason to imagine that this would become her only voyage. 4 days later, the ship would be resting on the floor of the North Atlantic. More than 1,500 people would be dead. And the world would discover that size, wealth, engineering, and confidence could not guarantee survival. National Archives +1. But the story of Titanic does not really begin with the iceberg. It begins with an idea. An idea that human beings could build something so powerful, so sophisticated, and so carefully designed that the ocean itself would have difficulty defeating it. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Atlantic Ocean was more than a stretch of water separating Europe and America. It was one of the most important highways in the world. Millions of people were crossing it. Immigrants were leaving Europe for new lives in the United States. Wealthy travelers crossed the ocean for business, politics, tourism, and social life. Trade depended on regular ocean transportation. And competing shipping companies understood something very clearly. The future of the Atlantic belonged to the ships that could carry more people, offer greater comfort, and cross the ocean with greater speed and prestige. Among the companies competing for this enormous market was the White Star Line. Its answer was a new generation of ocean liners. The Olympic-class ships were designed to dominate not merely through speed, but through scale and luxury. Titanic was one of them. Her designers were not simply trying to create a ship that could cross the Atlantic. They were creating a floating world. Inside Titanic were dining rooms, reception areas, luxurious cabins, public spaces, staircases, elevators, and elaborate interiors designed to give wealthy passengers an experience unlike anything they had known at sea. At the same time, the ship carried another world almost completely separated from that of the first-class passengers. Thousands of people traveling to America were not going for luxury. They were going because they were searching for a future. They were immigrants, families, workers, and individuals hoping that somewhere across the Atlantic was a life better than the one they were leaving behind. This difference would become one of the most important human dimensions of the disaster. Because when Titanic began to sink, everyone aboard was facing the same ocean. But they did not all experience the disaster in the same way. The confidence surrounding Titanic was extraordinary. The ship carried 20 lifeboats, a number that exceeded the legal requirement of the time. But those boats could not accommodate everyone aboard. This was not simply a technical oversight. It reflected the safety standards and assumptions of the period. Ships were operating under regulations that had not fully adapted to the enormous size of the newest ocean liners. Titanic technically complied with the regulations. But the regulations themselves were no guarantee that everyone could survive a catastrophe. And that distinction would become painfully important. National Archives +1. Still, none of this mattered on the morning of April 10. Titanic was moving west. Southampton was disappearing behind her. Her destination was New York. For passengers, the voyage was beginning like any other great transatlantic crossing. There were meals to attend, conversations to have, decks to explore, letters to write, plans for arrival. For some passengers, the voyage represented wealth and privilege. For others, it represented hope. And for the crew, it was a demanding professional assignment aboard one of the most important ships ever placed into service. Nobody knew that the clock had already begun counting down. As Titanic crossed the Atlantic, the atmosphere aboard the ship remained largely normal. The ocean was vast. The ship was moving through it at high speed. And the passengers had every reason to believe that the crew knew exactly what it was doing. But the North Atlantic in April was not an empty space. It was a dangerous environment. Ice could drift far south from Greenland, creating fields of icebergs along major shipping routes. And on April 14, Titanic began receiving wireless warnings about ice in the region. These warnings would later become central to investigations into the disaster. Historical records show that reports of icebergs and ice fields were circulating in the North Atlantic, and at least one warning passed through Titanic's own wireless system. National Archives. But a warning is not the same thing as a disaster. The ship continued. The passengers continued their evening. And the ocean remained dark. Then came the night. April 14, 1912. The temperature had fallen. The sea was exceptionally calm. There was little wind. There was no dramatic storm. No giant waves were crashing against the ship. At first glance, it might have appeared to be an ordinary night in the middle of the Atlantic. But the calmness of the sea created another problem. An iceberg could be difficult to see against a dark horizon when there was little wave activity around it. The ocean ahead was becoming a place where darkness itself could hide danger. At 11:40 p.m., the lookouts spotted an iceberg ahead. The warning was given. The ship began maneuvering. But the distance was too short. Titanic struck the iceberg. The collision was not the explosive movie scene many people imagine. There was no enormous wall of ice crashing through the entire ship. Instead, the impact damaged the hull along the ship's side. And that damage was enough. Water began entering compartments that Titanic could not afford to lose. The ship had been designed with watertight compartments to limit flooding. But the damage extended across enough compartments that the system could no longer save her. The great ship was no longer merely sailing through the Atlantic. She was beginning to fill with it. National Archives +1. At first, many passengers did not understand what had happened. That may be one of the most haunting parts of the story. A ship of this size does not immediately feel like a sinking ship. The decks remained largely intact. Lights were still burning. Passengers were still inside. Some people were awakened. Others were barely aware that anything unusual had happened. The crew began assessing the damage. And then the truth became unavoidable. Titanic could not remain afloat. The ship had been mortally damaged. There was no realistic way to repair her in the middle of the ocean. The only question left was how many people could escape. And this is where the story changes. Because Titanic's greatest weakness was no longer the iceberg. It was time. There were only a limited number of lifeboats. There were thousands of people aboard. And the crew had to transform a luxury liner into an evacuation operation in the darkness of the Atlantic. The first lifeboats began leaving the ship. But another problem appeared. Some lifeboats were launched without being filled to their full capacity. The reason was partly psychological. Passengers did not fully understand the danger. Some were reluctant to leave a giant ship that still appeared stable. And officers had to convince people to enter small open boats while the enormous Titanic remained behind them. To many passengers, the lifeboats looked more dangerous than the ship. They could not yet imagine what would happen next. As the night progressed, the situation became increasingly desperate. Titanic's wireless operators sent distress signals. Other ships were somewhere in the North Atlantic. But distance mattered. A ship could receive the message and still be hours away. The closest vessel able to respond was the RMS Carpathia. Her captain, Arthur Henry Rostron, ordered the ship toward Titanic's position. But Carpathia also had to navigate through an area where ice had been reported. She was racing toward a disaster while entering the same dangerous environment that had already crippled Titanic. The rescue would take time. And Titanic did not have much of it. National Archives. On Titanic, the separation between passengers was beginning to disappear. The luxury of the first-class decks no longer mattered in the same way. The enormous dining rooms, expensive cabins, fine decorations, and social status could not stop the rising water. Yet the evacuation itself was not equal. Third-class passengers faced additional barriers, including their location within the ship and the difficulties of reaching the boat deck. The disaster would later raise serious questions about class, access, evacuation procedures, and whether every passenger had been given an equal chance to survive. These questions would become central to the investigations that followed. But on that night, there was no time for history. There was only survival. And slowly, Titanic began to change. The ship that had seemed enormous and permanent was becoming smaller in the darkness. Passengers watched lifeboats disappear into the distance. Some boats rowed away because their occupants feared being pulled down by the sinking ship. Others remained nearby. Above them, Titanic's lights continued to shine against the black Atlantic. For the people still aboard, the most terrifying realization was becoming clear. The lifeboats were leaving, and there were not enough of them. The ocean was freezing, the night was dark, and the distance between Titanic and the approaching Carpathia was measured not only in miles, but in time. At some point during those final hours, the confidence of the Titanic's first voyage disappeared completely. The ship was no longer a symbol of technological triumph. It was a place where every minute mattered. And somewhere in the darkness, the Atlantic was waiting. By the early morning hours of April 15, Titanic's final moments were approaching. The bow was sinking deeper. The stern was rising. The remaining passengers were being forced toward the higher sections of the ship. And the great liner was approaching the point where even her enormous structure could no longer remain intact. At approximately 2:20 a.m., Titanic disappeared beneath the North Atlantic. More than 1,500 people lost their lives. Only hundreds survived in the lifeboats. The Carpathia would arrive later that morning and rescue the survivors. When the rescue operation was complete, the world would finally begin to understand the scale of what had happened. National Archives. But the sinking of Titanic was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of another one. Because once the survivors reached New York, the questions began. Why did Titanic continue through an area where ice had been reported? Why were there so few lifeboats? Why were some lifeboats launched partially empty? Why did so many people die when Titanic had been equipped with modern safety systems? And perhaps the most important question of all, was Titanic's destruction simply an unavoidable accident, or was it a disaster created by a series of human decisions? Those questions would lead to investigations, testimony, lawsuits, changes in maritime regulations, and a fundamental reconsideration of safety at sea. The Titanic had disappeared beneath the ocean. But the investigation into why she sank was only beginning. Before Titanic became the most famous shipwreck in history, she was something else entirely. She was an idea born at a time when the Atlantic Ocean had become one of the great highways of the modern world. Europe and North America were becoming more closely connected every year. Ships carried immigrants, businessmen, wealthy travelers, workers, mail, and cargo across the ocean. And the companies operating those ships were engaged in a fierce competition. The question was no longer simply, who can build a ship that crosses the Atlantic? The question was, who can build the ship that makes every other ship look ordinary? For the White Star Line, the answer would come through a new generation of enormous ocean liners. And Titanic would be one of them. The competition for the Atlantic. At the beginning of the 20th century, the White Star Line was competing against some of the most powerful names in the shipping industry. Speed mattered, but White Star Line pursued a somewhat different strategy. Instead of making speed the only measure of success, the company emphasized size, comfort, reliability, and luxury. The plan was ambitious. Build ships so large that passengers would feel as though they were traveling in a floating city rather than crossing an ocean. The result was the Olympic class. The first of the three sister ships was Olympic. The second was Titanic. A third ship would eventually enter the class as Britannic. Titanic was not created as an isolated experiment. She was part of a much larger strategy. And that is important, because it explains why the ship looked the way she did. She was designed from the beginning to be enormous. Belfast, where Titanic began. The physical story of Titanic begins in Belfast, Ireland, at the enormous shipyard of Harland and Wolff. This was not a small workshop where a few craftsmen assembled a ship piece by piece. Harland and Wolff was one of the world's major shipbuilding enterprises. The company had the experience, machinery, workforce, and facilities required to construct vessels on a scale that had previously been difficult to imagine. Titanic was assigned yard number 401. Her sister Olympic was yard number 400. The two ships were constructed side by side, using enormous building berths that had to be adapted for vessels of unprecedented size. Contemporary technical descriptions of the project showed just how extensively the shipyard had to organize its facilities around these giant liners. Encyclopedia Titanica +1. And then, in 1909, the work began. The keel, the fundamental backbone of the ship, was laid down. The construction of Titanic had officially entered its physical phase. From that point forward, the ship would grow piece by piece. Steel frames rose from the keel. Plates were fitted around them. Rivets joined sections together. The skeleton slowly became a hull. And what was once an empty space in a Belfast shipyard began taking the shape of a vessel that would eventually carry thousands of people across the Atlantic. Royal Museum's Greenwich records the conventional construction timeline as the keel being laid on March 31, 1909, the launch on May 31, 1911, completion on March 31, 1912, and sea trials on April 2. RMG. A ship on a different scale. Titanic was approximately 882 feet and 9 inches long. Her beam, the width of the ship, was about 92 feet. Her gross registered tonnage was approximately 46,328 tons. Those numbers are difficult to visualize today. So imagine a structure nearly 3 football fields long, built almost entirely from steel, rising above the water like a moving piece of architecture. The ship was so large that even experienced observers were dealing with a new scale of engineering. The contemporary technical publication The Shipbuilder described the Olympic-class vessels in detail, including their massive steel construction, structural reinforcement, and dimensions. Encyclopedia Titanica. Titanic was not simply made bigger by stretching an older ship. Her structure had to be engineered to deal with enormous forces. Every part of the vessel had to work with every other part. The hull, the decks, the engines, the boilers, the electrical systems, the ventilation, the water systems, the passenger accommodations, the cargo spaces, the navigation equipment, and the systems designed to control flooding. The result was a complicated machine in which thousands of individual components had to function together. And that complexity would later become one of the most important parts of Titanic's story. Because when something goes wrong on a machine this large, the consequences do not necessarily remain small. The ship was divided into compartments. One of Titanic's important safety features was her subdivision into watertight compartments. The basic principle was straightforward. If part of the hull was damaged and water entered one section, watertight barriers could limit the spread of flooding. This was a major part of the confidence placed in large ocean liners of the period. Titanic's design incorporated watertight bulkheads and other measures intended to protect the ship against serious damage. The official British investigation later examined these very features, asking what special provisions had been incorporated into Titanic's design and construction to protect the vessel and the people aboard her. TitanicInquiry.org+1. But there is an important distinction here. A ship can have watertight compartments without being completely immune to flooding. The effectiveness of such a system depends on where the damage occurs, how much water enters, and how the flooding interacts with the structure of the ship. That distinction would become tragically important 3 years after Titanic's keel was laid. But in 1909, nobody knew how the design would perform under the exact circumstances that eventually confronted it. The ship grows. For months, Titanic's hull continued to take shape. By the spring of 1910, much of the framing had risen. The hull plating followed. The empty skeleton became an enclosed steel structure. And then came the moment when the ship had to leave the building berth. On May 31, 1911, Titanic was launched. The launch was not the completion of the ship. In some ways, it was only the beginning of another enormous stage. The hull could float, but Titanic was not yet the luxurious passenger liner people would later recognize. She still needed her machinery, her interiors, her electrical systems, her passenger accommodations, her propellers, her boilers, her fittings, her communications equipment, and countless other components. The ship had to be transformed from a floating steel hull into a functioning ocean liner. Titanic Belfast records that after the launch, the ship entered the fitting out stage, with the vessel officially completed and handed over to the White Star Line in April 1912. TitanicBelfast.com+1. Inside the machine, the public would eventually remember Titanic for her luxurious interiors. But beneath those interiors was an enormous industrial machine. Titanic used a combination of reciprocating steam engines and a low-pressure turbine to drive 3 propellers. Steam had to be produced in large numbers of boilers. Fuel had to be loaded. Firemen and engineers had to work continuously to keep the machinery operating. The ship was effectively a huge energy system. Coal entered the ship. Men worked around the clock to burn it. Steam was produced. Mechanical power was generated. And that power moved thousands of tons of steel through the Atlantic. The official records describe Titanic as a 3-screw vessel, with 2 triple expansion engines and a low-pressure Parsons turbine. TitanicInquiry.org+1. This was not technology designed for a quiet coastal voyage. It was built for the open Atlantic. Then there was the luxury. But Titanic was not designed only for engineers. For passengers, the most visible achievement was what happened above the machinery. The ship was divided into classes. First class offered an extraordinary level of comfort for the period. There were elegant public rooms, dining facilities, private accommodations, and spaces designed for passengers who expected luxury even while thousands of miles from land. Second class offered a different level of accommodation but was still remarkably comfortable compared with many earlier ocean voyages. And then there was third class. These passengers were often traveling for an entirely different reason. They were not crossing the Atlantic simply for pleasure. Many were immigrants. They were leaving Europe with the hope of beginning new lives in the United States and Canada. Their experience of Titanic was fundamentally different from that of the wealthiest passengers. This meant that Titanic was not merely carrying people. She was carrying different versions of the early 20th century world. The wealthy, the middle class, workers, immigrants, professionals, families, children, crew members. Each group entered the same ship through a different doorway and experienced the voyage through a different social world. That social structure would matter enormously when the ship eventually had to be evacuated. The price of the giant. A ship of this scale required an enormous investment. The United States Senate inquiry later recorded Titanic's fully equipped cost as approximately £1.5 million, equivalent in that contemporary report to roughly $7.5 million. TitanicInquiry.org. That figure represented an extraordinary investment for the period. Titanic was not simply an expensive passenger vessel. She was a statement. A statement about what the shipping industry could build. A statement about the financial power behind the White Star Line. And, perhaps most importantly, a statement about confidence in the future. The ship was designed to make the Atlantic crossing safer, more comfortable, and more impressive. But the future had already begun changing the meaning of safety. Ships were getting larger. Passenger numbers were increasing. Technology was becoming more sophisticated. And yet some maritime regulations had not advanced at the same speed. This contradiction would later become one of the most important lessons of Titanic. The question of lifeboats. Titanic carried 20 boats in total. That included 14 regular lifeboats, 2 emergency boats, and 4 collapsible boats. Together, their officially stated capacity was approximately 1,178 people. TitanicInquiry.org +1. That number sounds large, but Titanic could carry far more people than that. And this is where history becomes uncomfortable. The ship's lifeboat capacity was not simply the result of someone deciding that lifeboats were unimportant. The problem was deeply connected to the regulations of the era. The British Board of Trade's rules governing lifeboat requirements had been established when ships were dramatically smaller. The later British inquiry explicitly criticized the delay in updating those requirements as ships grew to enormous sizes. TitanicInquiry.org. So Titanic could legally sail with a lifeboat capacity that was nowhere near enough for everyone aboard. That does not mean Titanic was legally considered unsafe before the voyage. In fact, the British inquiry concluded that Titanic complied with the applicable regulations before leaving Queenstown. TitanicInquiry.org. But legality and actual safety are not always the same thing. That distinction would become one of the great lessons of the disaster. The ship that inspired confidence. As Titanic neared completion, she represented the technological optimism of her age. Her designers had not set out to build a ship that would become famous because it sank. They were trying to build something extraordinary. Something reliable. Something comfortable. Something capable of crossing the Atlantic with thousands of people aboard. And in many ways, they succeeded. Titanic was an extraordinary engineering achievement. That is precisely what makes her story so powerful. The disaster did not happen because Titanic was a primitive vessel. It happened to a ship that represented some of the most advanced capabilities of its time. And that creates a much more interesting historical question. What happens when human confidence grows faster than human understanding? The final preparations. By early 1912, the enormous construction project was approaching its end. Titanic's machinery was installed. Her interiors were being completed. Her systems were tested. The ship was prepared for service. And finally, she had to prove that she could actually perform as intended. That meant sea trials. On April 2, 1912, Titanic underwent her trials in Belfast Lough in the Irish Sea. Her handling was tested, her machinery was tested, her ability to maneuver was examined. The tests were successful enough for the ship to be accepted for service. Royal Museum's Greenwich records the sea trials on April 2 and the ship's subsequent departure for Southampton before her maiden voyage. RMG. There was no dramatic warning from the sea. No iceberg appeared. No disaster occurred. Titanic passed the tests and was ready. She was then taken to Southampton. The next stage of her life was no longer construction. It was service. Passengers would soon walk aboard. Crew members would take their positions. The engines would start. The gangways would be removed. And Titanic would finally enter the Atlantic as a working passenger liner. But there was one thing nobody could test in Belfast. They could test her engines. They could test her steering. They could test her machinery. They could inspect her construction. But they could not recreate the exact combination of darkness, calm water, ice, speed, human decisions, and time pressure that awaited her in the North Atlantic. That test would come later. And it would come only once. On April 10, 1912, Titanic left Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York, with planned stops at Cherbourg and Queenstown. RMG. For the passengers watching the ship pull away, the departure was not the beginning of a tragedy. It was the beginning of an adventure. Some were traveling toward wealth. Some toward business. Some toward family. Some toward a completely new life. And the ship beneath them was carrying the confidence of an entire age. She had taken years to design. Years to construct. Millions of pounds to complete. Thousands of workers had contributed to her creation. And, now, at last, she was moving under her own power. Titanic was no longer a project in a Belfast shipyard. She was a living world at sea. And on board that world were people who had no idea that 4 days later, the Atlantic would ask Titanic the one question that her builders could never answer in advance. On the morning of April 10, 1912, Titanic stood at Southampton. She was ready. The engines were prepared. The decks were clean. The cabins had been arranged. And one by one, people began coming aboard. To the world outside, they were simply passengers. But there was nothing simple about the people gathered on that ship. They came from different countries, different social classes, different professions, and completely different circumstances. Some had enormous fortunes. Some were traveling for business. Some were returning home. And some had spent years saving money for a single journey that they believed would change the rest of their lives. They were all entering the same ship. But they were not entering the same world. A floating cross-section of society. When Titanic finally left Queenstown for the open Atlantic on April 11, she carried 1,316 passengers and approximately 885 members of the crew, according to the British Inquiry. TitanicInquiry.org+1. The passengers were divided into 3 principal classes. There were 325 first-class passengers, 285 second-class passengers, and 706 third-class passengers. The numbers alone tell us something important. Titanic was not primarily a ship for the extremely wealthy. The largest passenger group was third class. And many of those people were crossing the Atlantic because they were trying to build a different future. That distinction is essential to understanding the human story of Titanic. Because when disaster eventually came, the people aboard were not simply statistics. They had destinations. They had families. They had plans. And they had reasons for being there. The first-class world. At the top of Titanic's social hierarchy was first class. For wealthy passengers, the voyage was designed to be an experience of extraordinary comfort. The ship offered elegant public rooms, dining facilities, private cabins, and spaces where passengers could socialize without feeling as though they were simply traveling from one continent to another. For some first-class passengers, the Atlantic crossing was almost an extension of their normal lifestyle. They were accustomed to expensive hotels, private servants, fine clothing, elaborate meals, and exclusive social circles. Titanic brought many of those things onto the ocean. And among the first-class passengers were some of the most prominent figures aboard the ship. One of the best known was John Jacob Astor IV. Astor was an American millionaire, businessman, inventor, and member of one of the country's wealthiest families. He was traveling with his young wife, Madeline. Their presence immediately reflected one of the striking realities of Titanic. The ship was carrying people whose wealth placed them among the most privileged individuals of their era. But Astor was not the only wealthy American aboard. There was also Benjamin Guggenheim, a member of the powerful Guggenheim family. There was Isidor Straus, the businessman associated with Macy's, traveling with his wife Ida. There was George Whittier, another enormously wealthy American, traveling with members of his family. And there were many others whose names appeared in newspapers and business circles of the period. These people were not simply passengers. They were representatives of an economic world that had been transformed by industrialization. America was becoming extraordinarily wealthy. Industrial fortunes had grown. Large companies had emerged. And the people who controlled those fortunes could now travel across the Atlantic in a level of comfort that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. But Titanic was not only about money. Walk away from the first-class dining rooms and you entered a completely different social world. Second class occupied the middle. Its passengers were not necessarily poor. Many were professionals, teachers, clergy, businessmen, academics, and families with considerably more modest financial circumstances than those in first class. Their accommodations were simpler. But compared with the standards available on many earlier ships, second-class travel could still be remarkably comfortable. And this is one of the details that makes Titanic interesting. The ship represented a society that was becoming increasingly mobile. People were crossing borders. Families were moving between continents. Professionals were traveling for work. Students were studying abroad. Businessmen were expanding their connections. The Atlantic was becoming less of a barrier. It was becoming a highway. And Titanic was one of the most impressive vehicles on that highway. Then there were the people at the bottom of the ship. Below, the world of luxury was third class. And here, the story changes completely. Many third-class passengers were immigrants. They came from different parts of Europe and were heading toward North America. Some were traveling alone. Others were traveling with husbands, wives, children, brothers, sisters, or friends. They were carrying luggage, documents, personal belongings, photographs, and sometimes almost everything they owned. For them, America represented possibility. A job, a new home, a reunion with relatives, a chance to escape poverty, a chance to begin again. The British Inquiry recorded that about 410 of Titanic's third-class passengers were foreigners, and estimated that, including people from other classes and parts of the crew, nearly 500 people aboard may not have been English-speaking. TitanicInquiry.org. So Titanic was also a ship of languages. English was not the only language being spoken. People from different parts of Europe brought their own cultures and traditions aboard. And for many of them, the voyage represented one of the biggest decisions they had ever made. Why were they going to America? To understand Titanic's third-class passengers, we have to understand the world they were leaving behind. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of Europeans migrated to North America. Economic opportunity was one major factor. Industrialization had created new jobs in American cities. Railroads were expanding. Factories were growing. Cities were attracting workers. But migration was also driven by poverty, political conditions, religious pressures, family circumstances, and the desire for a better future. And immigration was not always a simple journey. For many people, getting to America required crossing the Atlantic in steerage or third class. The ship was therefore more than transportation. It was the final barrier between an old life and a hoped-for new one. Imagine boarding Titanic knowing that somewhere on the other side of the ocean, a relative was waiting for you. Or perhaps nobody was waiting. Perhaps you were going to America because you believed you could create something there. That possibility was powerful enough to bring millions of people across the Atlantic. A family's journey. Among Titanic's passengers were families traveling together. That changed the emotional meaning of the voyage. A single passenger could make a decision for himself. A family had to make decisions for everyone. Parents had children. Children depended on parents. And many families had already endured difficult journeys before reaching Southampton. For some, the Titanic voyage was only one stage in a much longer migration. They had left their homes. They had traveled by train. They had crossed borders. They had arrived at the port. And finally, they had reached the enormous ship that would take them across the ocean. They believed the difficult part of the journey was almost over. They did not know that the most dangerous part had not yet begun. The crew, the people who made Titanic function. But there was another group aboard Titanic that is sometimes forgotten. The crew, nearly 900 people, worked to keep the ship operating. The British inquiry divided the crew into major departments including deck, engine, and victualling departments. It recorded 66 people in the deck department, 325 in the engine department, and 494 in the victualling department. TitanicInquiry.org. These people had completely different jobs. Officers navigated the ship, engineers operated the machinery, firemen and coal handlers worked in the heat below deck, stewards served passengers, cooks prepared food, seamen maintained the vessel, barbers, waiters, cleaners, postal workers, and other employees performed specialized duties. Titanic could appear effortless to a first-class passenger. A meal appeared at the table. A cabin was clean. Luggage was moved. A corridor was illuminated. Hot water was available. The ship seemed to take care of everything. But behind that appearance was an enormous workforce. Hundreds of people were working so that thousands of others could enjoy the journey. Below the luxury, some of the hardest work happened where passengers rarely saw it. Deep inside the ship, engineers and firemen worked around the machinery. Coal had to be moved. Furnaces had to remain active. Steam pressure had to be maintained. Machinery had to be monitored. The engines could not simply be turned on and forgotten. The ship was a living industrial system, and the men who operated it worked in an environment of heat, noise, smoke, and constant physical labor. Their world was separated from the elegant public spaces above, but both worlds depended upon each other. Without the engineers, Titanic could not move. Without the stewards and service staff, the luxury experience would disappear. Without the deck crew, navigation and seamanship would become impossible. Every passenger saw Titanic from a different perspective. But the ship only functioned because thousands of individual responsibilities were connected. Captain Smith. At the center of the command structure was Captain Edward John Smith. Smith was an experienced commander of the White Star Line. He had spent decades at sea and had commanded other large passenger vessels before Titanic. For many passengers, his presence represented experience and authority. He was not an unknown young officer being given command of his first ship. He was a senior captain approaching the end of a long career. And Titanic's maiden voyage was expected to be an important final chapter in that career. The image of Smith has become complicated over the centuries since the disaster. Some accounts portray him as a calm and respected commander. Others have focused on decisions made during the voyage. But the historical record is more complicated than a simple hero or villain story. The investigation after the disaster examined the actions of the captain, officers, crew, company, and authorities. And that is important. Titanic was not controlled by one person alone. It was a complex organization. Decisions were distributed across many levels. Thomas Andrews. Another important figure was Thomas Andrews. Andrews was closely connected to the design and construction of the Olympic-class ships and was one of the senior figures at Harland and Wolff. He knew Titanic better than almost anyone else aboard. He understood the ship's construction. He understood her compartments. He understood her machinery. He understood what she had been designed to withstand. And when Titanic eventually suffered catastrophic damage, his knowledge would become crucial. He was aboard the maiden voyage partly to observe the ship in service and identify anything that might need improvement. That sounds ordinary. A shipbuilder examining his creation. But history would give that role a much darker meaning. Because Andrews would eventually be forced to assess the condition of the ship he had helped create. And the answer would be devastating. The officers. Titanic's bridge was staffed by experienced officers. Among them was William Murdoch, the first officer. There was Charles Lightoller, second officer. Herbert Pittman served as third officer. Joseph Boxhall served as fourth officer. Harold Lowe was fifth officer. And James Moody was sixth officer. These men were responsible for navigation, watches, ship handling, and emergency procedures. Their training was based on the maritime practices of their era. They were expected to maintain discipline. They were expected to understand the ship. And they were expected to respond when something went wrong. At the time Titanic sailed, none of them knew that within days they would face an emergency that would become one of the most studied maritime disasters in history. One passenger carried a camera. Among the people aboard Titanic was a young Irish Jesuit priest named Francis Brown. Brown traveled from Southampton to Queenstown. He did not continue across the Atlantic. That decision would have an extraordinary consequence. Because Brown had taken photographs during his time aboard Titanic. Those images would later become some of the most valuable visual records of the ship before the disaster. He photographed passengers, the ship's interiors, deck life, and ordinary moments that seemed completely unimportant at the time. A passenger standing on deck, people walking, meals, the ship itself. Nobody looking at those photographs in 1912 could have known how historically important they would become. Because once Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic, every surviving photograph became a window into a world that no longer existed. The last moments before departure. As Titanic prepared to leave Southampton, the atmosphere was not one of fear. It was excitement. People were beginning a journey. Passengers explored the ship, crew members settled into their duties. Families arranged their cabins. First-class travelers moved through elegant public rooms. Third-class passengers prepared for the long Atlantic crossing. The ship's enormous engines were ready, and Southampton harbor was crowded with activity. Then came departure. Titanic moved away from the dock. The land began to recede. The people aboard were now committed to the voyage. For many passengers, the first hours must have felt extraordinary. They were aboard the largest and most famous new liner of the age. The ship seemed powerful, modern, safe, and enormous. But the maiden voyage was not yet fully underway. Titanic still had to make her stops in France and Ireland. At Cherbourg, additional passengers would board. Then came Queenstown, where more passengers would join the ship before she finally headed toward the open Atlantic. The passenger records showed just how international this voyage became, with people boarding at Southampton, Cherbourg, and Queenstown. Encyclopedia Titanica +2. And after Queenstown, there would be no more scheduled stops before New York. The next destination was America. Queenstown, the last link to land. On April 11, Titanic reached Queenstown, Ireland. For some people, this was the final opportunity to step aboard. For others, it was the final opportunity to step off. Among those who disembarked at Queenstown was Francis Brown. He had taken photographs of Titanic during his short journey. He would later look back at those photographs with the knowledge that he had left the ship only hours before she began her long Atlantic crossing. That small decision changed the course of his life. And it also preserved a remarkable visual record. After Queenstown, Titanic headed west. New York was now the destination. Ahead lay the open North Atlantic. Behind her was Europe. And aboard the ship were more than 2,000 people whose lives had been brought together by one enormous vessel. They did not all know each other. They did not speak the same languages. They did not share the same wealth. They did not have the same reasons for traveling. But for the next few days, they would all share the same moving world. Titanic. The ship continued westward. The passengers settled into the rhythm of life at sea. Meals, conversations, walks on deck, letters, games, work, sleep, routine. Nothing about those first hours suggested that history was moving toward catastrophe. And yet, far ahead of Titanic, in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, ice was already present. The danger was not yet visible. The passengers could not see it. The crew could not see it. And Titanic continued forward, at full confidence, at full speed, toward a continent that was still several days away. And in the next chapter, the voyage would begin to change. Because the Atlantic was about to become more than an ocean between Europe and America. It was about to become the setting for the most famous maritime disaster in modern history. After leaving Queenstown, Titanic finally turned toward the open Atlantic. The last connection with Europe was disappearing behind her. Ahead lay New York. For the passengers, the journey had entered a new phase. There would be no more ports. No more scheduled stops. For the next several days, Titanic would be surrounded by nothing but ocean. And yet, for most people aboard, there was little reason to feel uneasy. This was supposed to be the easy part. The ship had left land behind. Now all they had to do was cross the Atlantic. But the North Atlantic in April was not an ordinary stretch of water. It was a region where weather could change quickly, visibility could disappear in seconds, and enormous fields of drifting ice could move southward into the routes used by ocean liners. Titanic was heading directly into that environment. Life at sea. Once the ship was fully underway, Titanic settled into a routine. The engines worked continuously below. The officers maintained their watches on the bridge. Lookouts scanned the horizon. Stewards moved through the passenger areas. Meals were prepared and served. Passengers walked the decks, talked with one another, read newspapers, wrote letters, played games, and simply enjoyed being aboard one of the most impressive ships in the world. For first-class passengers, the voyage could feel almost like staying in a luxury hotel that happened to be moving across the ocean. The ship had elegant dining rooms and lounges. There were libraries, smoking rooms, reception areas, and other spaces designed specifically for social life. The passengers could move through an environment that was deliberately designed to make them forget how far they were from land. But the farther Titanic traveled west, the more isolated she became. Below the polished surfaces was an enormous industrial machine. Thousands of tons of steel were moving through the Atlantic at high speed. And keeping that machine moving required constant work. A different world below deck. Deep inside Titanic, the atmosphere was completely different. The passengers saw polished wood, carpets, furniture, glass, and electric lighting. The engineers saw machinery. The firemen worked around the furnaces. Coal was constantly being consumed to produce the steam required by the engines. The ship's enormous boilers generated the power that ultimately drove her propellers. The system was complicated and demanding. Every part had to work. A failure in one area could affect another. And hundreds of crew members were responsible for keeping the entire system operating. This was the hidden side of Titanic. The luxury that passengers experienced depended on an enormous amount of labor that most of them never saw. The first full day. As Titanic continued westward, the passengers settled into the rhythm of the voyage. For many, the first full day at sea was probably one of fascination rather than fear. There was something extraordinary about looking out and seeing nothing but ocean. The horizon stretched in every direction. There were no buildings, no roads, no railway lines, no familiar landmarks, only the sea. For immigrants traveling toward America, that view could have carried a completely different meaning. Behind them was the life they had known. Ahead was an uncertain future. And somewhere beyond that enormous horizon was New York. For wealthy passengers, meanwhile, the crossing was part of a world they already knew. They expected to arrive in America in comfort. They had schedules to keep, business to conduct, families to meet, homes to return to. The same ship therefore carried people with completely different expectations. Yet everyone was moving toward the same destination. Titanic's speed. Titanic was built for speed as well as comfort. The ship had 3 propellers. 2 were driven by enormous reciprocating steam engines. The central propeller was powered by a low-pressure turbine. Together, these systems gave Titanic extraordinary power for a passenger liner of her time. Her maximum speed was around 23 knots. During the voyage, however, speed was not simply a matter of pressing a throttle and going faster. The officers had to consider weather, visibility, sea conditions, traffic, and navigation. The Atlantic was not an empty swimming pool. Other ships were moving through it. Ice could be present, and the officers had to navigate using the technology available in 1912. There was no GPS, no satellite imagery, no modern radar, no digital navigation display showing an approaching iceberg. The officers depended on charts, compass readings, celestial navigation, visual observations, and wireless communication. That last technology would become extremely important. The wireless room. Titanic carried a Marconi wireless installation. It was one of the most modern communication systems available to passenger ships. Wireless operators could send messages across the ocean without a physical connection to land. For passengers, this was revolutionary. They could send personal messages. Businesses could communicate. Families could receive news. And the ship could communicate with other vessels and coastal stations. But the wireless operators were not primarily there to navigate the ship. Their work centered heavily on passenger telegrams and commercial communication. The wireless room was therefore a bridge between Titanic and the outside world. As long as the equipment was working and operators were listening, information could travel across hundreds of miles of ocean. That would prove crucial, because during Titanic's voyage, other ships would report ice. And those warnings would reach Titanic through the wireless system. The ocean changes. As Titanic continued westward, the character of the voyage began to change. The weather was not necessarily dramatic. There was no cinematic storm approaching. No enormous waves were rising around the ship. The danger was much quieter. The danger was ice. In April, large quantities of ice could drift south from Arctic regions into the North Atlantic. Icebergs were only the visible part of a much larger problem. A ship could encounter floating ice in many forms. There could be large icebergs, smaller pieces of ice, and broad fields of ice that could make navigation dangerous. Titanic was entering a region where reports of ice were becoming increasingly important. And this is where the story begins to move away from the image of an unstoppable luxury liner. Because Titanic was not traveling through an empty ocean. She was traveling through an environment that could destroy a ship if the wrong circumstances came together. April 14th. Sunday, April 14th, began as another day aboard Titanic. Passengers attended religious services. They ate breakfast and lunch. They walked the decks. They socialized. The crew continued their duties. The ship continued westward. Nothing about the morning announced what was coming. But that day, Titanic's wireless operators received several messages concerning ice. These messages came from other vessels traveling through the North Atlantic. The reports varied in detail and location. Some warned of icebergs. Others reported large quantities of field ice. The warnings were not necessarily treated as a single emergency. There was no universal system in 1912 requiring every ice report to produce an immediate reduction in speed. Captains had to interpret the information and make decisions based on the conditions they believed they were facing. And Titanic continued on her course. Why didn't Titanic simply stop? This question has been asked for more than a century. If ice was being reported, why didn't Titanic simply slow down dramatically? The answer is more complicated than it first appears. Ocean liners operated according to schedules. Speed mattered. A faster crossing could be commercially valuable. But that does not mean the captain knowingly ordered the ship into certain destruction. The officers were working within the assumptions and practices of their time. They believed they could navigate safely. They had lookouts stationed forward. They had officers on the bridge. They had navigation equipment. They were receiving wireless information. And they were operating a ship that had been designed to withstand serious damage. The disaster was not caused by one simple decision. It emerged from a chain of circumstances. And that chain was getting longer. The passengers knew nothing. One of the most striking aspects of Titanic's final day is the contrast between what was happening inside the ship and what the passengers understood. For many people, April 14th was simply another day of travel. Dinner was served. Conversations continued. People dressed for the evening. The first-class dining room was filled with passengers enjoying an elaborate meal. The ship appeared completely normal. There was no visible sign that Titanic was approaching a moment that would transform maritime history. This is one of the reasons the story remains so powerful. Disasters often become obvious only after they have begun. Before the event, everything can appear ordinary. Titanic was not sailing toward a visible wall. She was sailing toward something that was almost impossible to see in the darkness. The night becomes strangely quiet. As evening approached, the temperature dropped. The sky was exceptionally clear. The sea became remarkably calm. At first, that sounds like good weather. But for a lookout searching for ice, calm conditions could create a dangerous problem. When waves break against an iceberg, the white water can make the object easier to see. On an unusually calm sea, there may be less visual disturbance. The horizon can become a dark, almost seamless line. And on that particular night, the absence of moonlight made the situation even more difficult. The stars were visible. The air was cold. The ocean was dark. And Titanic continued forward. The lookout post. High above the deck, 2 lookouts were stationed in the crow's nest. Their job was simple in principle. Watch, search, report anything dangerous. But the conditions were difficult. They were looking across an enormous dark ocean. There was no modern radar screen showing a target. There was no automated warning system. Their eyes were the primary detection tool. If an iceberg appeared ahead, they had to see it. Then they had to communicate what they saw. Then the bridge had to react. That entire sequence could take only moments. At Titanic's speed, those moments mattered enormously. The last hours of normality. Inside the ship, people were beginning to prepare for another night. Some passengers had already gone to bed. Others were still awake. The first-class areas remained elegant and comfortable. In second and third class, passengers followed their own routines. The crew continued working. In the wireless room, operators were still processing messages. On the bridge, officers maintained their watch. And in the crow's nest, the lookouts continued scanning the darkness. Everyone was doing what they were supposed to do. Yet the ship was moving into a region where the consequences of even a small delay could be catastrophic. The distance between safety and disaster was shrinking. Not because the ship was suddenly malfunctioning. Not because the weather had become violent. But because an object was somewhere ahead. Hidden in the darkness. 11:40 p.m. At approximately 11:40 p.m., the lookout saw something ahead. An iceberg. The warning was immediately communicated to the bridge. The alarm was raised. The order was given to change the ship's course. The engines were ordered to respond. The crew reacted. The Titanic was enormous. And she was moving fast. A ship of that size could not turn like a small boat. The distance between Titanic and the iceberg was already dangerously short. The officers had only seconds. What happened next has been reconstructed through testimony, evidence, and later investigations. But one fact is beyond dispute. Titanic struck the iceberg on her starboard side. The impact did not produce the dramatic explosion that later films would make famous. There was no enormous fireball. Instead, there was a much more terrifying problem. The ship had been damaged below the waterline. And water was entering compartments that were never supposed to fill. The moment everything changed. For most people aboard Titanic, the impact was confusing. Some passengers barely noticed it. Others felt a vibration. Some heard an unusual sound. Many did not immediately understand what had happened. But below deck, the situation was becoming clear. Water was entering the ship. The ship's watertight compartments had been designed to limit flooding. But the damage extended across enough compartments that the system could not save the vessel. The question was no longer whether Titanic had been damaged. She had. The real question was whether the damage was fatal. Thomas Andrews examined the situation. The answer was devastating. Titanic would not remain afloat. The ship had only a limited amount of time. And now the officers had to face the impossible task of telling more than 2,000 people that the ship they believed would carry them safely to New York was sinking beneath them. The passengers still did not understand the full danger. Many were asleep. Some were still dressed for the evening. Others had begun to gather in corridors. Crew members started preparing lifeboats. Orders were being given. Doors were being opened. And the wireless operators began sending a message that would become one of the most famous distress calls in history. Titanic needed help. Far away in the darkness, other ships were receiving the signal. But they were not all equally close. And the nearest help was still many miles away. The clock was now running. At 11:40 p.m., Titanic struck the iceberg. For the people standing on the bridge, the event lasted only moments. For the people below deck, its consequences had already begun. Water was entering the ship. But the full meaning of that damage was not immediately obvious to everyone aboard. Titanic was still lit. Her engines were still operating. Her decks were still above the water. From the perspective of many passengers, the ship did not look like a vessel that was about to disappear. That illusion would not last. The first assessment. After the collision, Captain Edward Smith moved quickly to understand what had happened. Thomas Andrews, who knew Titanic's design intimately, inspected the damage. What he discovered was devastating. The flooding was not confined to one small area. Several forward compartments had been damaged. Titanic's watertight system could protect the ship from certain kinds of flooding, but there was a limit to how much damage the design could survive. Once enough compartments were compromised, the ship's fate was effectively determined. Andrews understood the mathematics of the situation. Titanic was going down. The only question was how long she had. The answer was measured in hours. Not days. Not even an entire night. The ship had a limited window in which more than 2,000 people had to be moved from a sinking liner into a relatively small number of lifeboats. The invisible danger. The most frightening part was that Titanic did not immediately appear to be sinking. There was no enormous hole visible from the decks. The passengers could not see the damage beneath the water. Many had barely understood the collision. Some thought the ship had simply hit something. Others wondered whether the vibration had been caused by machinery. The enormous liner still looked powerful. Still looked stable. Still looked capable of continuing toward New York. But below the waterline, the situation was moving in only one direction. The bow was gradually becoming heavier. As water entered the forward compartments, the ship began settling lower into the sea. And as the bow went down, water could move farther through the damaged areas. Titanic was entering a process that could no longer be reversed. The crew prepares for an evacuation. The order was given to prepare the lifeboats. This was not a simple task. Titanic had more than 2,000 people aboard. Yet the total capacity of her lifeboats was only around 1,178 people. Even if every lifeboat had been filled to its rated capacity, hundreds would still have had nowhere to go. And there was another problem. The passengers had not been expecting an evacuation. They had boarded Titanic believing that she was one of the safest and most advanced ships in the world. Now crew members had to persuade them to leave that ship. Into small open boats. In freezing weather. In the middle of the Atlantic. At night. That psychological barrier was enormous. The first lifeboat prepared for launch was Lifeboat No. 7. It was lowered from the starboard side shortly after midnight. But something immediately became apparent. The boat was not filled to capacity. Only around 24 people entered a boat designed to hold significantly more. This would become one of the recurring tragedies of the evacuation. There were not enough lifeboats for everyone. Yet some of the boats that did leave Titanic were not carrying as many people as they could have carried. Why? Part of the explanation was fear. Passengers did not fully understand that Titanic was doomed. Some were reluctant to leave. Others believed that staying aboard a huge ship was safer than entering a small wooden boat in the middle of the ocean. The officers also had to balance loading the boats carefully. They were operating in darkness. They were dealing with frightened passengers. And the ship itself was becoming increasingly unstable. The evacuation was happening under circumstances for which nobody aboard had real experience. Women and children. The order that became central to the evacuation was women and children first. But this instruction was not interpreted identically by every officer. At some boats, women and children were given priority while men were permitted to enter if seats remained. At other boats, officers were stricter. This inconsistency would later affect survival. And it reflected something deeper about Edwardian society. The evacuation was being organized according to social expectations of the time. Men were often expected to remain behind. Women and children were expected to be protected. But there was no universal system for how the rules should be applied. Every officer had to make decisions in real time. The second lifeboats. More lifeboats were prepared. The process was slow. The boats had to be uncovered. Passengers had to be gathered. Crew members had to organize loading. The davits had to lower the boats safely. And everyone was working on a ship that was gradually becoming more dangerous. Titanic's designers had expected the lifeboats to be used as a means of transferring passengers to rescue ships if necessary. The assumption was not that all passengers would spend hours floating in the open Atlantic. The boats were therefore part of a larger evacuation philosophy. But on this night, there was no nearby rescue ship waiting beside Titanic. The lifeboats were becoming the passengers' only protection from the ocean. The wireless operators. Meanwhile, inside Titanic's wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were working desperately. Their equipment connected Titanic to the outside world. The operators began sending distress messages. The famous signal CQD was used, along with the newer distress signal SOS. The purpose was simple. Tell other ships, Titanic is in serious trouble. We need help. The wireless room became one of the most important places on the ship. Because Titanic's survival now depended partly on people who were not even aboard her. Somewhere in the darkness, another vessel might receive the message. Somewhere, a captain might change course. Somewhere, help might be coming. But nobody knew exactly how long it would take. The Carpathia. One of the ships that received Titanic's distress call was the RMS Carpathia. Her captain, Arthur Henry Rostron, immediately ordered the ship toward Titanic's position. But Carpathia was not sitting nearby. She was roughly 58 miles away when the distress call was received, according to testimony from her officers. And she had to cross a dangerous region containing ice. Rostron ordered his ship to proceed at maximum speed. The heating system was reduced. Crew members prepared additional accommodations for survivors. Medical supplies were organized, and the ship raced through the darkness. But even at full speed, Carpathia could not arrive immediately. Titanic had to survive until she got there. That was the problem. Other ships hear the call. Titanic's distress signal was heard by more than one vessel. The Frankfurt received messages. The Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, also became involved in the wireless communications. The Baltic received information and began moving toward the area. But the most important ship in the rescue effort would be Carpathia. The disaster was now becoming a race against time. Titanic was sinking. Carpathia was coming. But the ocean between them was still enormous. Why didn't another ship save Titanic? This question would become one of the most controversial aspects of the disaster. One ship in particular, the Californian, was relatively close to the Titanic's location. But her wireless operator had stopped working for the night. The ship was surrounded by ice and had stopped for the night. Her crew later reported seeing rockets in the distance. But they did not understand that those signals represented an emergency aboard Titanic. The question of what the Californian's crew saw, what they understood, and what they could have done became a major subject of the later investigations. This was not simply a question of distance. It was a question of communication, interpretation, procedure, and human judgment, and it would remain controversial for decades. The ship begins to change. Back aboard Titanic, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly serious. The bow was lower. Water continued to spread. The ship's forward section was sinking deeper. Passengers were being directed toward the boat deck. But many still did not understand the scale of the emergency. Some were reluctant to leave. Others believed that Titanic was safer than the lifeboats. And some passengers simply had no idea what was happening. This was one of the great problems of the evacuation. The crew knew more than the passengers. But even the crew did not know exactly how the final hours would unfold. They had no previous disaster with Titanic to use as a guide. They were writing the emergency procedure while living through it. The lifeboats leave one by one. Lifeboat after lifeboat was lowered. And again, boats departed with empty seats. This became one of the most tragic features of the disaster. There were not enough lifeboats. But the boats that existed were not always used to their full capacity. Part of the problem was the lack of urgency among passengers. Another problem was uncertainty among crew members. How many people could safely enter a boat? Would the davits hold? Would the boat remain stable? Would too many people damage it? Would passengers panic? Every decision carried risk, and every minute that passed made the situation worse. The lights are still on. For a while, Titanic remained brightly illuminated. That created an extraordinary visual contrast. The ship was sinking, yet her interior lights still glowed. Passengers stood on the decks under electric illumination. The ocean around them was almost completely black. The lifeboats were small islands of humanity floating away from the enormous ship. And in the distance, there was no city. No harbor. No coastline. Only darkness. The longer the evacuation continued, the more obvious it became that the lifeboats were moving away from something that could no longer save itself. The temperature. The water outside was brutally cold. The North Atlantic in April could kill an unprotected person within a very short period of time. This meant that anyone who entered the ocean without a lifeboat faced an almost impossible survival challenge. There was no modern survival equipment. No insulated survival suits. No helicopters. No nearby rescue aircraft. No emergency beacon guiding rescuers directly to individual survivors. A person in the water would be exposed to the cold until rescue arrived. That reality made the lifeboats even more important. A lifeboat was not simply transportation. It was the difference between life and death. The last distress messages. Inside the wireless room, Phillips and Bride continued sending messages. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Titanic's electrical power would not last forever. The ship was sinking deeper. The wireless operators knew that time was running out. Still, they continued working. Their task was no longer routine communication. They were trying to bring help to more than 2,000 people. The messages became increasingly urgent. And somewhere in the darkness, Carpathia continued racing toward them, the final stage of the evacuation. As the night moved toward morning, Titanic's angle became increasingly severe. The bow was disappearing deeper into the Atlantic. The stern was rising. Passengers were being forced toward the upper decks. The lifeboats that remained aboard were becoming more difficult to launch. The ship's enormous structure was now under forces it had never been designed to experience. This was the moment when Titanic's size stopped being an advantage. A large ship can provide comfort. A large ship can provide stability. A large ship can carry thousands of people. But when a large ship begins to sink, the number of people who must be evacuated becomes a massive logistical problem. Titanic's greatest strength had become part of the scale of the disaster. The ocean around Titanic. Below the lifeboats, the Atlantic was almost completely dark. People in the boats could see Titanic towering above them. Some could hear the sounds coming from the ship. Others were already far enough away that Titanic appeared like a glowing structure in the distance. But nobody in those boats could change what was happening. The only thing they could do was wait. Wait for Carpathia. Wait for dawn. Wait to see whether the ship would remain afloat long enough for the remaining passengers to escape. And for those still aboard Titanic, the situation was becoming desperate. The ship had less and less time. The final boats. Eventually, almost all of the usable lifeboats had left Titanic. But hundreds of people were still aboard. There were simply not enough spaces. Some passengers remained trapped by the circumstances. Others were still trying to reach the boat deck. And some did not yet fully comprehend that this was the final stage. There would be no second chance. There would be no return voyage. There would be no rescue boat large enough to take everyone. The great ship that had been designed to carry people safely across the Atlantic was now becoming the greatest danger they faced. And the final minutes were approaching. Titanic had been built to survive. Her designers had divided her hull into watertight sections. Her builders had constructed her from enormous quantities of steel. Her engineers had given her tremendous mechanical power. Her owners had presented her as one of the most advanced passenger ships in the world. Yet none of those achievements could stop the ocean from entering the ship. The question was no longer whether Titanic would sink. That had already been decided. Now came the final question. What would happen to the people who were still aboard when the ship finally broke apart? And in the darkness of the North Atlantic, Titanic began to reach the point from which there would be no return. By the early morning hours of April 15, 1912, Titanic was no longer simply a damaged ship. She was a dying ship. The lifeboats were disappearing into the darkness one after another. The people remaining aboard were being pushed toward the highest parts of the vessel. The bow was sinking deeper. And the time available to escape was disappearing with it. But the most terrifying part was still ahead. Because Titanic had not yet reached the point where she could no longer remain structurally intact. That moment was coming. The ship is losing its balance. As water flooded the forward compartments, the bow became progressively heavier. Titanic's enormous stern remained higher above the sea. The ship was no longer sitting level. Her angle was changing. For passengers on the decks, this change became increasingly obvious. Walking was becoming more difficult. Objects began sliding. Furniture shifted. Water moved through parts of the ship. And the higher the bow sank, the higher the stern rose. The ship was effectively becoming a gigantic lever. At the same time, the weight of the water inside the forward sections was increasing. The forces acting on Titanic were becoming enormous. The remaining passengers. By now, the people still aboard Titanic were concentrated largely around the upper decks. Some were trying to reach the remaining lifeboats. Others were separated from family members. Some passengers had already realized that there would not be enough boats. The emotional atmosphere was changing rapidly. The earlier confusion had been replaced by fear. People who had initially refused to leave Titanic were now desperately looking for a place in a lifeboat. But many of the boats had already disappeared into the darkness. The opportunity was closing. The last lifeboats, the final collapsible boats, were among the most difficult to launch. Titanic's increasing angle made the process extremely dangerous. The crew had to work while the ship itself was becoming unstable. One of the collapsible boats, Collapsible C, was launched from the starboard side. Another, Collapsible D, followed. These boats were among the last to escape the ship. But even after they left, many people remained aboard. There was now no realistic way to evacuate everyone. The remaining passengers were facing the final stage of the disaster. The wireless room. Somewhere inside Titanic, the wireless operators continued working. Jack Phillips had been sending distress messages for hours. His job had become almost impossible. The ship's electrical systems were under increasing strain. The wireless room itself was no longer a safe place. Yet the operators continued transmitting. Their messages had already summoned help. Carpathia was coming, but she was still too far away. The tragedy of Titanic was becoming a question of time. Could the ship remain afloat until rescue arrived? The answer was no. Carpathia races through the dark. Captain Arthur Rostron was pushing Carpathia toward Titanic's position as quickly as possible. The ship's crew had been ordered to prepare for survivors. Cabins were opened. Medical areas were prepared. Blankets and warm clothing were gathered. Food and hot drinks were organized. The crew knew they were not simply going to meet another ship. They were going to meet a disaster. But the ocean was filled with ice. Rostron could not simply charge forward blindly. The same environment that had endangered Titanic was now slowing the rescue operation. Carpathia had to navigate carefully while still moving as fast as circumstances allowed. Every mile mattered. Every minute mattered. The lights of Titanic. From the lifeboats, Titanic still appeared enormous. Her lights remained visible. The ship's silhouette rose above the water. The people in the boats could see the vessel that had carried them across the Atlantic only hours earlier. But now it was sinking. For many survivors, this image would remain with them for the rest of their lives. A giant illuminated ship in the darkness. Then gradually, the angle became more severe. The stern rose higher. The bow disappeared deeper. Titanic was beginning to resemble something impossible. A ship standing at an angle in the middle of the Atlantic. The band. Among the people aboard Titanic were the ship's musicians. As the emergency progressed, members of the band continued playing music. Exactly which pieces were played during the final hours has been debated, and later accounts were not completely consistent. But survivors consistently remembered the musicians playing as the ship sank. Whatever the exact sequence of songs, the image became one of the most enduring symbols of the disaster. Music continuing while a ship was dying. Passengers frightened. Crew members working. Lifeboats disappearing. And musicians attempting to maintain some sense of calm. Whether every detail of the famous later stories can be established with certainty, the broader fact remains that the musicians played during the evacuation. Their actions became part of Titanic's mythology. The final minutes. The ship was now approaching a critical point. The bow was far below the surface. The stern was rising dramatically. The structural stresses were enormous. Passengers gathered on the higher decks. Some held onto railings. Others struggled to remain standing. Loose objects moved across the decks. The ship's angle continued to increase. Then came the moment when Titanic could no longer behave as a single intact structure. The ship began to break apart. For decades, there was debate over exactly how Titanic sank and whether the hull broke before or after the final plunge. Later research, including the discovery of the wreck, provided important evidence about the breakup. The stern separated from the bow. The two sections followed different paths downward. And Titanic entered the final stage of her voyage. The bow disappears. The forward section of Titanic descended into the Atlantic. Thousands of tons of steel were pulled downward by gravity. Water rushed over the decks. The ship's lights eventually disappeared. For those still aboard, there was nowhere else to go. The lifeboats were already away. The ocean surrounded them, and the temperature of that ocean was lethal. The ship that had been designed to carry them safely across the Atlantic was now taking them toward the bottom. The stern rose dramatically before eventually losing its remaining support. For the people watching from the lifeboats, the sight must have been almost impossible to comprehend. A ship hundreds of feet long was standing at an extreme angle above the ocean. Then the stern began its final descent. At approximately 2:20 a.m., Titanic disappeared beneath the surface. The voyage that had begun less than 5 days earlier was over. The world's most famous ocean liner was gone. But the disaster itself was far from finished. The people in the water. After Titanic disappeared, the ocean was filled with people. This is one of the darkest realities of the disaster. The lifeboats could not immediately rescue everyone. Many people had entered the freezing water. The conditions were almost impossible for human survival. The North Atlantic water was close to the freezing point. Within minutes, exposure could become fatal. The people in the lifeboats heard cries across the darkness. Survivors later described the sound. But there was a terrible dilemma. If the lifeboats immediately returned toward the crowd, they risked being overwhelmed. Some boats did turn back. Others remained where they were. The crews had to decide whether they could safely return without endangering the people already aboard. It was an impossible choice. The last silence. Eventually, the cries began to fade. The ocean became quiet. Titanic was gone. The lifeboats were scattered across the darkness. The survivors had no idea exactly when rescue would arrive. They had no radio communication with the lifeboats themselves. They could only wait. Some survivors were injured. Others were freezing. Families had been separated. Some people did not know whether their relatives had escaped. And there was no way to know who had survived. The only certainty was that Titanic was gone. Carpathia arrives. Then, in the early morning, the survivors saw something they had been waiting for. Carpathia. The rescue ship finally reached the area. The lifeboats began approaching her. One by one, survivors were brought aboard. Crew members helped them climb. Warm clothing was distributed. Medical assistance was provided. Food and hot drinks were prepared. For the survivors, stepping onto Carpathia meant something enormous. They were alive, but the relief was mixed with grief. Because everyone understood that most of the people who had been aboard Titanic were not coming. The number of dead. The exact number of people who died has been reported differently depending on how passenger and crew records are counted. But more than 1,500 people lost their lives. Only around 700 survived. The scale of the loss was enormous. It included wealthy businessmen, immigrants, crew members, women, men, children, people whose names would become famous, and thousands whose stories would receive far less attention. The disaster did not belong to one social class. It affected the entire ship. But it did not affect everyone equally. The survival rates differed dramatically between classes and between men and women. That would become one of the most important subjects of the investigations that followed. Titanic's final journey. Titanic had left Southampton on April 10. She had traveled through Cherbourg. She had stopped at Queenstown. Then she crossed the Atlantic. On the evening of April 14, she struck an iceberg. At approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, she disappeared beneath the ocean. The entire disaster had unfolded in less than 3 hours from the collision to the sinking. A ship that had taken years to design and build had been destroyed in a matter of hours. And now came the question that would dominate newspapers around the world. How could this have happened? The world learns. When Carpathia began the journey toward New York with the survivors aboard, information about the disaster started spreading. But communication in 1912 was nothing like it is today. There were no smartphones, no television broadcasts, no internet, no social media. News traveled through telegraph networks, newspapers, and wireless messages. And because Titanic had been one of the most famous ships in the world, the news spread rapidly. At first, reports were confused. Some early reports suggested that Titanic had been damaged but remained afloat. Others claimed that another ship was towing her. The truth took time to become clear. Titanic had disappeared, and more than 1,500 people were dead. The questions begin. The sinking immediately created a series of questions. Why had Titanic been traveling through an area where ice had been reported? Why were there so few lifeboats? Why were the lifeboats launched without being filled? Why did the evacuation take so long? Why did the nearby Californian not reach Titanic? Why did the ship's wireless operators continue working until the last moments? Could more people have survived? And perhaps the most fundamental question, was Titanic's disaster preventable? Those questions would soon move from newspaper headlines into government investigations. Witnesses would testify. Officers would be questioned. Survivors would describe what they had seen. Experts would examine the ship's design. And governments would begin reconsidering the rules that governed passenger safety at sea. More than a shipwreck, Titanic's sinking was therefore not simply the story of a ship hitting an iceberg. It became a test of an entire system. The shipping company, the shipbuilders, the captain, the officers, the crew, the wireless operators, the lifeboat regulations, the board of trade, the emergency procedures, and the assumptions of an age that believed technology had made enormous ships almost invulnerable. The iceberg had damaged Titanic. But the disaster raised a much larger question. Had human beings built a system that was too confident in itself? The ocean keeps the evidence. After Titanic disappeared, the North Atlantic closed over the wreck. For decades, the ship remained beyond human reach. Stories grew around the disaster. Some were accurate, some became exaggerated, some were transformed into myths. But the physical evidence remained somewhere below the surface. Titanic's wreck would not be discovered until 1985. When the wreck was finally located, it changed the historical investigation forever. For the first time, researchers could examine the remains of the actual ship. They could see where the bow had come to rest, where the stern lay, how the two sections had separated, and what the ocean had preserved. The discovery would eventually help answer questions that had remained unresolved for generations. But in April 1912, none of that was known. All the survivors had was memory. And memory can be powerful. But it can also be incomplete. The survivors would eventually reach New York. Families would wait on the docks. Journalists would demand information. Governments would begin investigations, and the world would discover that the disaster was not going to disappear with the ship. Titanic had gone beneath the Atlantic. But the questions she left behind were only beginning. When the survivors of Titanic reached New York, the disaster was no longer a story unfolding in the darkness of the North Atlantic. It had become a global crisis. People wanted answers. Families wanted to know what had happened to their loved ones. Governments wanted to know why more than 1,500 people had died. And the public wanted to know how a ship that had been presented as one of the greatest achievements of modern engineering could disappear on her maiden voyage. The questions were immediate. Who made the decisions? Who failed to act? Could Titanic have been saved? And most importantly, could so many deaths have been prevented? The answers would not come from newspaper speculation alone. They would come from formal investigations. 2 countries, 2 investigations. Titanic was a British ship. She had been built in Belfast. She was owned by the British shipping company White Star Line. Her captain and most of her crew were British. But the ship had been carrying many American passengers, and she had been traveling toward New York. That meant both Britain and the United States had a powerful interest in discovering what had happened. The United States Senate launched an investigation only days after the disaster. Senator William Alden Smith traveled to New York to begin questioning survivors and witnesses. The British government later conducted its own formal inquiry under the leadership of Lord Mersey. The 2 investigations examined many of the same questions. But they also reflected different legal systems, witnesses, and priorities. Together, they created one of the most important records of the disaster. The United States Senate inquiry. The American investigation began in New York on April 19, 1912, only days after Carpathia arrived with survivors. The hearings eventually moved to Washington. Witnesses were questioned under oath. Among those questioned were survivors, officers, members of the crew, representatives of the White Star Line, and people involved in communications and rescue operations. The investigators wanted to reconstruct the final hours. What had happened? Who had known what? When had they known it? And what could have been done differently? The testimony revealed that Titanic had received warnings about ice. It also revealed the problems surrounding lifeboats, wireless communication, and the failure of nearby assistance to arrive in time. But the inquiry was not simply looking for one person to blame. It was examining an entire system. The question of ice. One of the most important issues was Titanic's decision to continue through an area where ice had been reported. The North Atlantic had already produced warnings. Other ships had encountered ice. Titanic's wireless operators had received messages. So investigators wanted to know, why was Titanic still traveling at high speed? This was not a simple question. There was no modern standardized system for transmitting iceberg warnings to every ship and automatically requiring a reduction in speed. Captains made judgments based on the information available to them. But the Senate inquiry examined whether Titanic's speed was appropriate under the circumstances. The question became especially important because Titanic's speed reduced the amount of time available to detect and avoid an iceberg. The faster a ship travels, the farther it moves during every second. If an obstacle is spotted only at the last moment, speed can make the difference between avoiding it and hitting it. The lookout question. Investigators also examined the men stationed in Titanic's crow's nest. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were the lookouts on duty when the iceberg was sighted. Their testimony became important. They described the darkness and the conditions under which they had been searching. They had no binoculars available to them in the crow's nest. This detail attracted enormous attention. Could binoculars have allowed the iceberg to be spotted earlier? It is tempting to answer yes. But history requires more caution. The exact effect of binoculars under those particular conditions cannot be established with certainty. The iceberg was dark. The sea was exceptionally calm. There was no moonlight. And Titanic was moving quickly. The important point is not that one missing piece of equipment automatically caused the disaster. The more important point is that Titanic's detection system depended heavily on human vision under extremely difficult conditions. The lifeboat problem. The investigations then turned to one of the most obvious failures. There were not enough lifeboat spaces for everyone. Titanic carried more than 2,000 people. Her lifeboats could accommodate only around 1,178. That meant that even if every boat had been filled perfectly, hundreds of people would still have been left behind. The British inquiry later examined the regulations governing lifeboat requirements and concluded that the existing system had failed to keep pace with the increasing size of modern passenger ships. This was one of the clearest lessons of Titanic. The problem was not simply that Titanic lacked enough lifeboats. The deeper problem was that the regulations allowed a ship of Titanic's size to operate with a level of lifeboat capacity that was fundamentally inadequate for a full evacuation. Legal does not mean safe. This distinction is extremely important. Before Titanic's voyage, she had passed the required inspections. She complied with the applicable British regulations. Her lifeboat arrangements were legal under the rules that existed at the time. So why did the disaster reveal such a massive safety problem? Because regulations are created at a particular moment in history. Technology changes, ships become larger, passenger numbers increase, but laws and safety standards can take years to catch up. Titanic exposed that gap. The ship was designed according to one era's rules while operating in a technological environment that had already moved beyond those rules. Why were the lifeboats not full? This became another major question. Titanic had enough lifeboat capacity for only part of the people aboard. But even that limited capacity was not fully used. Several lifeboats left the ship with empty seats. Investigators wanted to know why. The explanation was partly psychological. Passengers did not believe Titanic was going to sink. Imagine standing on the deck of a huge ocean liner. The ship is still illuminated. The decks are still above water. The engines may still be running. And an officer tells you to climb into a small open boat and leave the ship. You might hesitate. That is exactly what some passengers did. The crew also had to make decisions about how many people could safely enter each boat. The evacuation was not being conducted under calm conditions. It was a rapidly developing emergency. The Californian question. Then came one of the most controversial issues of all. The nearby Californian. The ship had stopped because of ice. Her wireless operator had gone off duty for the night. Her crew later reported seeing rockets. But they did not understand that those signals represented a distress situation aboard Titanic. The American inquiry questioned Captain Stanley Lord and other witnesses about what had happened. Could Californian have reached Titanic? Could more people have been saved? What did the crew actually see? What did they know? And when did they know it? The controversy became intense. The British inquiry later examined the matter as well. The evidence was complicated. The exact circumstances of what was observed from Californian remained disputed. But the disaster exposed a weakness in maritime communication. A distress signal is useful only if someone is listening, understands it, and acts. The wireless operators. Titanic's wireless operators became central witnesses. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride had worked through the final hours. Their equipment had been used to send distress messages to ships across the Atlantic. But there was another issue. Wireless communication in 1912 was still a relatively new technology. There were no modern emergency channels operating under today's standardized procedures. Operators were employed primarily by the Marconi Company. Their responsibilities included passenger messages as well as ship-to-ship communication. And the wireless room could become extremely busy. The Titanic disaster helped demonstrate that wireless communication was not merely a convenience. It was a critical safety system. The captain, Captain Edward Smith, became one of the central figures in the public debate. Was he responsible? Did he make the wrong decision by maintaining Titanic's speed? Should he have slowed the ship after receiving ice warnings? Should he have taken a different route? These questions remain part of the historical discussion. But it is important to avoid turning the entire disaster into the actions of one man. Smith operated within the practices of his time. Other ships also continued moving through areas where ice had been reported. There was no universal rule requiring every vessel to stop or reduce speed whenever an iceberg warning was received. The disaster emerged from multiple factors: human decisions, technology, regulations, environmental conditions, communication, and timing. Blaming everything on one person would make the story simpler. But it would also make it less accurate. Thomas Andrews' role. Thomas Andrews was also examined through survivor accounts. As one of the men closely involved with Titanic's design, he understood the ship's condition better than most people aboard. According to survivor testimony, Andrews recognized that the ship was doomed and helped passengers and crew during the evacuation. His role became symbolic of the tragedy. The man who had helped create Titanic was forced to confront the failure of his creation. But even here, history requires caution. Titanic was not a completely defective ship. Her basic design did not simply fail everywhere. Instead, she encountered damage beyond what her subdivision system could survive. That distinction matters. The disaster was not proof that every part of Titanic's engineering was wrong. It demonstrated the limits of the design under an extreme flooding scenario. The breakup question. For decades, there was another major mystery. Did Titanic break apart before sinking? Survivors had provided different accounts. Some remembered seeing the ship break. Others did not. Without the wreck, investigators had limited physical evidence. Then, in 1985, the wreck was located on the seabed. The discovery provided a new source of evidence. Titanic was found in two major sections. The bow and stern lay separated on the ocean floor. The wreck site showed extensive structural damage. The discovery helped confirm that the ship had broken apart during the sinking. Modern research has continued to examine exactly how the breakup occurred. The wreck transformed Titanic research. But it also demonstrated something important. Historical memory and physical evidence do not always tell the same story. The human cost. The investigations were concerned with more than engineering. They also exposed the human consequences of the disaster. Survival rates varied significantly according to class. Women and children generally survived at higher rates than men. First-class passengers had much greater access to the boat deck and were more likely to survive than many third-class passengers. The exact reasons were complicated. They included physical location within the ship, knowledge of the evacuation, access to upper decks, language barriers, family decisions, crew procedures, and the timing of the evacuation. This meant Titanic became more than an engineering disaster. It became a window into the social structure of the early 20th century. The third-class question. The treatment and survival of third-class passengers attracted particular attention. Many third-class passengers were immigrants. They were unfamiliar with the ship. Some did not speak English. They were located farther from the lifeboat deck than many first-class passengers. And they were dealing with a rapidly developing emergency. The popular image of locked gates deliberately preventing third-class passengers from escaping has often been simplified in later retellings. The historical reality was more complicated. There were barriers and controlled access points within the ship, partly related to immigration regulations and shipboard organization. But the evidence does not support the simple claim that the entire third-class population was intentionally locked below deck while first-class passengers escaped. The actual problem was more complicated. Location, communication, ship design, evacuation procedures, and social inequality combined to create very different chances of survival. That distinction matters, because the truth is already powerful without inventing details. The British inquiry. After the American investigation, Britain conducted its own inquiry. The British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry began in London on May 2, 1912. Lord Mersey presided. The inquiry examined hundreds of questions surrounding the disaster. Witnesses were called. Technical evidence was presented. The ship's construction was analyzed. The actions of the captain and officers were examined. The behavior of the Californian was investigated. The lifeboat arrangements were considered. And the broader question of maritime safety was placed under scrutiny. The final report did not simply say, "Titanic hit an iceberg." It examined how and why the disaster had happened. What the British inquiry found. The British inquiry concluded that Titanic's loss was caused by the collision with an iceberg. But it also identified serious contributing factors. One major issue was speed. The report concluded that Titanic was traveling at a speed that was too high given the prevailing circumstances. The inquiry also examined the lifeboat arrangements and the failure to have enough capacity for everyone aboard. And the disaster involving the Californian was scrutinized extensively. The report became one of the foundational documents for understanding Titanic. It also contributed to changes in maritime safety. Titanic changed the rules. The most important consequence of the disaster was not simply that people learned Titanic had sunk. Governments began changing how ships were regulated. The idea that a large passenger ship could legally carry thousands of people without enough lifeboat capacity became increasingly unacceptable. Wireless communication became more closely connected with maritime safety. International cooperation on maritime safety increased. And eventually, the disaster contributed to the development of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, commonly known as SOLAS. The first Solis Convention was adopted in 1914. It established much stronger international standards for ship safety, including requirements concerning life-saving equipment and wireless communications. Titanic had become a terrible lesson. But it was a lesson that changed the future of ocean travel. The world's confidence had been shaken. Before Titanic sank, the disaster would have sounded almost unimaginable. A massive luxury liner, a modern engineering achievement, thousands of people aboard, and yet the ship could still be destroyed in a few hours. The tragedy challenged the idea that technological progress automatically meant safety. Technology could make ships larger, faster, more comfortable, more powerful. But technology could not eliminate human error. It could not control the weather. It could not move an iceberg. And it could not guarantee that regulations would evolve as quickly as engineering. Titanic revealed the gap between what humans could build and what humans could control. But one question remained. The investigations answered many questions. But not everything. Some mysteries survived. Why exactly did the iceberg become visible so late? How much difference would binoculars have made? What exactly did officers see from the bridge? Could Titanic have avoided the collision if she had reacted differently? Could more people have survived if the lifeboats had been filled completely? Could Californian have saved hundreds more? And what exactly happened to the ship during the final breakup? Some of these questions have become clearer with modern research. Others remain debated. And that is one reason Titanic continues to fascinate historians. The story is not frozen. New evidence can change our understanding. The investigations had established something fundamental. Titanic was not destroyed by a single mistake. She was destroyed through a chain of circumstances. Ice, speed, visibility, human judgment, ship design, regulations, communication, evacuation, and time. Remove one element, and the outcome might have been different. But history does not allow us to rerun the night of April 14, 1912. We can only reconstruct it, study it, and learn from it. And decades later, another discovery would give historians something they had never possessed before. The actual wreck of Titanic. The ship that had disappeared in 1912 would finally be found. And what lay on the ocean floor would reveal that some of the most important questions about Titanic were still waiting to be answered. For more than 7 decades, Titanic remained hidden. The ship that had once been one of the most recognizable objects on Earth had disappeared into one of the most difficult environments humans had ever tried to explore. More than 2 miles beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, darkness surrounded the wreck. There was no sunlight, no human voice, no sound of engines, only the slow movement of deep ocean water. For the families of those who died, Titanic was a memory. For historians, it was an unanswered question. And for explorers, it was a mystery waiting at the bottom of the sea. But finding Titanic would require technology that did not exist in 1912. It would require deep-sea exploration, powerful cameras, specialized vessels, and eventually, a completely new way of looking at the disaster. The wreck was not where people expected. When Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic in April 1912, people knew approximately where the ship had gone down. But knowing a general location was not the same as finding a wreck lying more than 12,000 feet below the surface. The ocean is enormous, and Titanic had not simply dropped vertically from the exact point where she disappeared. As the ship sank, the bow and stern followed different paths. Debris spread across the seabed. The wreck itself became separated into major sections. For decades, expeditions searched for it without success. The technology needed to locate a ship at such a depth was still developing. The ocean floor remained largely unexplored, and Titanic was waiting in complete darkness. Why the wreck mattered? The wreck was not important only because Titanic was famous. It offered something investigators had never possessed in 1912. Physical evidence. Survivors had described what they saw. Officers had given testimony. Investigators had examined plans. Engineers had debated how the ship had broken apart. But every human account had limitations. People remembered events differently. Some witnesses were separated from one another. The darkness and confusion made precise observation extremely difficult. The wreck could provide another perspective. The actual ship could reveal where the damage occurred, how the structure had separated, where objects had fallen, and how Titanic had come to rest. The seabed could preserve evidence that human memory could not. The search for Titanic. The idea of finding Titanic had attracted explorers for decades. But serious technological progress came as deep ocean exploration advanced during the 20th century. Researchers developed better sonar systems. Submersible vehicles became more capable. And underwater photography began opening areas of the ocean that had previously been inaccessible. Yet Titanic remained extraordinarily difficult to locate. The depth alone created enormous technical challenges. At more than 12,000 feet below sea level, pressure is immense. Ordinary equipment cannot simply be lowered into that environment and expected to function. Everything has to be designed for extreme conditions. And there was another problem. The wreck might be enormous by human standards. But compared with the size of the Atlantic Ocean, it was tiny. Finding Titanic was like searching for a particular object across an enormous landscape while looking through darkness. Robert Ballard. One of the most important figures in the search was American oceanographer Robert Ballard. Ballard had spent years developing deep-sea exploration technology. His work involved remotely operated vehicles and systems capable of transmitting images from the ocean floor. But Ballard understood that simply searching for the ship itself might not be the most effective strategy. Titanic had not disappeared without leaving a trace. As the ship sank, objects would have fallen behind it. A trail of debris could lead explorers toward the main wreck. That insight became extremely important. Instead of searching only for a giant ship, researchers could search for the evidence surrounding it. A French-American expedition. In 1985, Ballard worked with French oceanographer Jean-Louis Michel and a team from the French research organization iframer. Their expedition used advanced sonar and underwater imaging technology. The mission was not simply a historical expedition. It was also a technological experiment. The team had to map the seafloor, analyze sonar returns, identify objects, and distinguish Titanic from the enormous amount of natural material scattered across the Atlantic floor. Every strange shape had to be examined. Most would not be Titanic. The search required patience, and the clock was always running. September 1, 1985. Then, in the early hours of September 1, 1985, the search changed. A camera transmitted an image from the seabed. At first, it was difficult to understand what they were seeing. Then came a clue. A piece of debris. Something unmistakably artificial. The team had found the debris field. And shortly afterward, they located the wreck itself. Titanic had finally been found. 73 years after disappearing beneath the Atlantic. The first images were haunting. The wreck was lying in darkness. The ship's bow was remarkably recognizable. Even after more than 7 decades underwater, major elements of the structure remained visible. There was the familiar shape of Titanic. But it was no longer the brilliant white and black ocean liner that had sailed from Southampton. It was a rust-covered wreck resting on the seabed. The discovery transformed Titanic from a story into a physical place. Historians could now see the ship. Not photographs from 1912. Not drawings. Not newspaper illustrations. The actual Titanic. 2 main sections. The wreck was found in 2 major pieces. The bow was relatively well preserved compared with the stern. The stern was much more heavily damaged. The separation of the 2 sections provided powerful evidence about the final moments. Titanic had not simply descended intact into the ocean. The ship had broken apart during the sinking. The wreck site also revealed a large debris field extending between and around the main sections. Thousands of objects had been scattered across the seabed. Personal belongings, pieces of machinery, fragments of the ship's interior, and countless small objects that had once belonged to ordinary passengers and crew. The ocean had preserved a physical record of the disaster. The bow became one of the most recognizable underwater images in history. Its shape remained surprisingly intact. The forward section rested on the seabed at a slight angle. Parts of the superstructure remained visible. The anchors were still present. The enormous hull extended into darkness. Looking at the wreck, researchers could recognize the ship's basic form. This was not simply a pile of metal. It was Titanic. The same bow that had once cut through the Atlantic was now buried in sediment more than 2 miles below the surface. The stern told a different story. It was far more damaged. The structure had been subjected to tremendous forces during the sinking. The stern section had risen dramatically before its final descent. When it struck the seabed, it suffered catastrophic structural damage. The wreckage was twisted, broken, scattered. The contrast between bow and stern provided important evidence about the final moments of Titanic. It showed that the two sections had experienced very different conditions during their descent. The debris field. Perhaps the most revealing part of the wreck site was not the main ship. It was the debris surrounding it. The seabed contained thousands of objects. Some were huge pieces of the ship. Others were remarkably small. The debris field showed how Titanic had broken apart and how objects had been carried downward. Researchers could study the distribution of material. Where heavy objects landed, where lighter objects traveled, how the ship's structure had separated, and how the wreck had interacted with the ocean floor. The seabed had become a historical archive. A new look at the iceberg damage. The discovery of Titanic also allowed researchers to reconsider the nature of the damage caused by the iceberg. For decades, popular explanations imagined a massive gash running along the side of the ship. But later analysis suggested something more complex. The collision caused damage along a significant section of the hull, involving openings and deformation that allowed water to enter multiple forward compartments. The iceberg did not need to tear Titanic open like a giant knife. The damage only needed to be extensive enough to allow progressive flooding beyond what the ship's watertight subdivision could handle. That distinction is important. Titanic did not sink because one gigantic hole instantly filled the ship with water. She sank because flooding progressed through enough compartments to make survival impossible. The watertight compartments. Titanic's watertight subdivision was one of her major engineering features. The ship had transverse bulkheads dividing the lower sections of the hull. These barriers were designed to contain flooding. But the system had limits. The bulkheads did not extend high enough to prevent water from eventually spilling over as the ship's bow sank deeper. Once the ship reached a sufficient angle, water could move from one damaged section into another. The result was progressive flooding. One compartment became flooded, then another, then another. The bow became heavier. The bow sank. And the process accelerated. This helped explain why Titanic could remain afloat for a while after the collision and then eventually reach a point of no return. The wreck and the myth of unsinkable. Titanic's wreck also changed how people thought about the famous claim that she was unsinkable. The phrase itself has often been simplified. Titanic's builders and owners did not officially guarantee that the ship could never sink under any circumstances. The ship was widely regarded as exceptionally safe. Its design incorporated advanced safety features. But no ship could be immune to every possible combination of damage. The wreck demonstrated the limits of Titanic's design. She could survive some flooding. She could not survive the particular pattern of flooding produced by the iceberg collision. That distinction is critical. The disaster was not proof that Titanic had been a useless engineering project. It was proof that even advanced engineering has limits. The wreck changed the story. Before 1985, Titanic existed largely through testimony and memory. After 1985, researchers had something new. They could return to the wreck, take photographs, map the site, study the structure, examine artifacts, and compare physical evidence with historical accounts. Some old assumptions were strengthened. Others were challenged. Some stories became more complicated. And some popular myths began to fall apart. The wreck did not provide every answer. But it gave historians a new kind of evidence. The ocean was changing the ship. There was another discovery that became increasingly important. Titanic was not frozen in time. The wreck was slowly being consumed by the ocean. Microorganisms were attacking the iron and steel. Rust formations developed across the structure. These formations became known as rusticles because they resembled hanging icicles. The wreck was deteriorating. This meant that Titanic was not an eternal monument resting at the bottom of the sea. It was slowly disappearing. Over time, more sections would collapse. Objects would be buried. Metal would corrode. The ship would gradually return to the ocean environment. The wreck itself therefore became a race against time. Researchers wanted to document it before it changed beyond recognition. WHO owns the wreck. The discovery also created a new set of questions. Who had the right to recover objects from Titanic? Could artifacts be removed? Should they be displayed in museums? Should the wreck be treated as a historical site? Or should it be left untouched? These questions became increasingly important as expeditions began visiting the site. Titanic was not simply an abandoned ship. More than 1,500 people had died there. For many families, the wreck was effectively a gravesite. That created an ethical dimension that did not exist with an ordinary shipwreck. The graveyard of the Atlantic. For many historians and relatives of victims, Titanic should be treated as a memorial site. The wreck lies far from land, yet it remains connected to thousands of human stories. Every object on the seabed once belonged to someone. A shoe, a piece of luggage, a plate, a bottle, a fragment of furniture. These are not merely objects. They are traces of people who were living ordinary lives until April 14, 1912. That is why the wreck can be both scientifically valuable and emotionally difficult to explore. It is a historical site, but it is also a final resting place. What the wreck could not tell us. Even after Titanic was found, one problem remained. A wreck can show physical evidence. It cannot tell us exactly what a person was thinking. It cannot explain why an officer made a particular decision. It cannot reproduce a conversation on the bridge. It cannot tell us precisely what every passenger saw. For those questions, historians still depend on testimony and documents. The wreck is one piece of the puzzle, not the entire puzzle, and this is why responsible Titanic history requires multiple forms of evidence. Survivor testimony, official investigations, ship plans, wireless records, newspaper accounts, photographs, and the wreck itself. When these sources are compared, the story becomes much more reliable. The technology of the discovery. The discovery of Titanic was itself a landmark in ocean exploration. The expedition demonstrated how remotely operated technology could investigate extreme depths without placing human divers directly inside the most dangerous environments. Cameras could move across the seabed. Images could be transmitted to the surface. Sonar could map areas too large to inspect visually. This technology would later contribute to exploration of many other deep-sea sites. In that sense, Titanic became more than a historical discovery. It became part of the development of modern ocean science. The wreck becomes a global symbol. Once photographs of Titanic reached the public, the image of the wreck became almost as famous as the story of the sinking itself. People who had grown up hearing about Titanic could finally see the ship. The bow resting in darkness. The broken stern. The debris field. The rust-covered remains. The images were powerful because they destroyed the distance between history and reality. Titanic was no longer only something that happened in 1912. It was still physically there, waiting in the deep. But the real story was still bigger. The wreck could show where Titanic ended. It could help explain how the ship broke apart. It could reveal physical damage. But it could not answer the most important human question. Why did so many people die when Titanic carried modern technology and a highly trained crew? That answer required looking beyond the iceberg. It required examining the world that created Titanic. The rules of the maritime industry. The culture of speed. The confidence in engineering. The limitations of communication. The social structure aboard the ship. And the assumptions that shaped decisions on that final night. Titanic's wreck was found in 1985. But the deeper investigation into the disaster never really ended. A ship that refuses to disappear. More than a century after the sinking, Titanic remains one of the most studied shipwrecks in history. The wreck continues to deteriorate. New technology continues to reveal details. Researchers continue to examine old evidence. And historians continue to debate questions that began in April 1912. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Titanic is this. The ship disappeared in a few hours. The story did not. It survived in newspapers, in courtrooms, in family memories, in museums, in photographs, and finally, in the darkness of the ocean itself. Titanic's physical remains gave us a way to look backward. But they also raised a new question. If the ship was not simply destroyed by an iceberg, if a whole chain of decisions and circumstances contributed to the disaster, then what exactly should the world have learned from Titanic? The answer would become visible not at the bottom of the Atlantic, but in the laws, technology, and safety practices that changed after 1912. Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic in April 1912. But the world she left behind was different from the world she had entered. The disaster had exposed weaknesses that were not limited to one ship. There were weaknesses in regulations, weaknesses in communication, weaknesses in emergency planning, and, perhaps most importantly, weaknesses in the assumption that modern technology alone could protect human life. Titanic had been built during an era of extraordinary confidence. Ships were becoming larger. Engines were becoming more powerful. Wireless communication was crossing oceans. Steel construction was transforming transportation. The modern world appeared to be moving faster than ever. Then, in a few hours, Titanic demonstrated that progress did not eliminate risk. It simply created new kinds of risk. The first lesson: everyone needs a place in a lifeboat. Perhaps the most obvious lesson was also the most devastating. Titanic did not carry enough lifeboat capacity for everyone aboard. That could no longer be considered acceptable. The old regulations had been based largely on the size of ships rather than the total number of people they carried. As passenger liners grew larger, the rules had failed to keep pace. Titanic exposed that contradiction. A ship could become enormous without being required to carry enough lifeboats for every person aboard. After the disaster, that system came under intense scrutiny. The idea that a ship should have enough life-saving capacity for everyone became increasingly central to maritime safety. The Titanic disaster had transformed lifeboats from a secondary consideration into a fundamental requirement. The 1914 Solis Convention. One of the most important consequences came at the international level. In 1914, governments adopted the first international convention for the safety of life at sea, commonly known as SOLAS. The convention addressed a wide range of maritime safety issues: lifeboats, wireless communication, emergency procedures, ship construction, fire safety, and other measures designed to reduce the risk of another Titanic-scale catastrophe. The timing was significant. The disaster had demonstrated that ocean safety could not be handled entirely through separate national systems. Ships crossed international waters. They carried passengers from many countries. They communicated with vessels from other nations. Safety therefore required international cooperation. Titanic helped push maritime safety toward that model. The end of the old lifeboat logic. Before Titanic, a ship's lifeboats could be viewed partly as a means of transferring passengers to another vessel. The assumption was that a serious emergency might involve another ship arriving to assist. Titanic challenged that assumption. What happens if there is no rescue ship immediately available? The lifeboats must be capable of keeping people alive independently. That meant capacity mattered. But capacity was not enough. People needed training. Crew members needed procedures. Launching systems needed to work under pressure. And passengers needed to understand what they were supposed to do. Titanic demonstrated that an evacuation is not simply a question of equipment. It is a coordinated human operation. Wireless communication becomes a safety system. Another major change involved wireless communication. Titanic's wireless operators had played a critical role in summoning help. But the disaster exposed weaknesses in the way wireless services were organized. Operators could become overwhelmed with passenger messages. There were gaps in communication between ships. And wireless operators were not necessarily required to maintain continuous watch in the way later regulations would demand. The lesson was obvious. A distress signal is useless if nobody hears it. After Titanic, wireless communication became much more closely integrated into maritime safety. Continuous monitoring became increasingly important. Ships needed a reliable way to communicate emergencies. And the radio operator's role became recognized as part of the safety system rather than simply a passenger communication service. The ice patrol. Titanic also changed how ships dealt with ice. One of the most important developments was the creation of the International Ice Patrol. The patrol was established in response to the Titanic disaster. Its purpose was straightforward: monitor icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping routes, track their movements, and provide warnings to ships. This represented a major change in philosophy. Instead of leaving individual captains to rely entirely on scattered reports from other ships, a dedicated organization would monitor the danger systematically. The North Atlantic was still dangerous. Icebergs did not disappear, but information about them could be organized and distributed more effectively. Technology and coordination could reduce the risk. The sea becomes more organized. Before Titanic, the ocean was an enormous space where individual ships operated with considerable independence. After Titanic, maritime safety increasingly became a coordinated international system. Ships were expected to follow standardized procedures. Wireless communication became more reliable. Ice warnings became more systematic. Lifeboat capacity became more important. Safety drills became increasingly significant. The modern concept of maritime safety was taking shape, and much of it grew from the lessons of one disaster. But Titanic did not create every safety change alone. It is important not to exaggerate Titanic's role. Maritime safety was already developing before 1912. Wireless technology was already spreading. Ships already had lifeboats. Governments already regulated passenger vessels. International maritime agreements already existed. Titanic did not invent maritime safety. What Titanic did was expose the weaknesses in the existing system with such devastating clarity that change became much harder to ignore. The disaster accelerated reforms. It gave policymakers evidence that existing assumptions could fail. And it created political pressure for stronger rules. The myth of technological invincibility. Perhaps the deepest cultural impact was harder to measure. Titanic had become a symbol of modern confidence. She was enormous, luxurious, technologically advanced. Her passengers included some of the wealthiest and most influential people of the era. Her very existence represented what industrial society believed it could accomplish. Then an iceberg stopped her. The lesson was not that technology was useless. The lesson was more uncomfortable. Technology has limits. Engineering can reduce risk. It cannot eliminate uncertainty. A powerful engine cannot make an iceberg disappear. A watertight compartment cannot guarantee survival under every possible flooding pattern. A wireless transmitter cannot rescue people by itself. A lifeboat is useless if nobody can reach it. Safety depends on the entire system. The human factor. Titanic also demonstrated the importance of human decision-making. The iceberg was not the only factor. People made decisions before, during, and after the collision. The ship's speed. The interpretation of ice warnings. The response to the iceberg. The evacuation. The loading of lifeboats. The handling of wireless communication. The response of nearby ships. Every stage involved human judgment. Modern safety engineering would eventually place increasing emphasis on the concept that accidents often result from multiple small failures rather than one dramatic mistake. Titanic is a powerful historical example of that principle. Speed and risk. The issue of speed remains one of the most discussed aspects of the disaster. Titanic was traveling at a high speed through an area where ice had been reported. At the time, high-speed ocean travel was part of the competitive world of transatlantic shipping. Companies competed for prestige. Passengers wanted shorter journeys. Schedules mattered. And captains were operating within the expectations of the industry. After Titanic, the relationship between speed and environmental conditions received much greater attention. The lesson was not simply, never travel fast. It was, speed must be appropriate to the conditions and the information available. That principle remains central to transportation safety today. Safety drills. Another lesson concerned preparation. It is one thing to have lifeboats. It is another to know how to use them. An emergency creates confusion. Passengers may not know where to go. Crew members may receive conflicting information. Equipment may behave differently under real emergency conditions than it does during routine operations. Titanic demonstrated that evacuation procedures must be practiced. Crew members need clearly defined responsibilities. Passengers need clear instructions. And emergency equipment needs to be accessible. Modern ships therefore developed increasingly formal approaches to emergency drills and passenger safety instructions. The importance of design. Titanic's fate also influenced thinking about ship design. The concept of watertight subdivision was not abandoned. Instead, engineers examined how such systems could be improved. The question became, how much flooding should a ship be able to survive? How high should bulkheads extend? How should compartments be arranged? What happens if several adjacent compartments are damaged? And how can a ship remain stable while flooding? These questions became central to the development of safer passenger ships. Titanic had demonstrated that surviving limited flooding was not enough. A ship had to be designed around realistic worst-case scenarios. The passenger experience. Titanic also changed the relationship between passengers and safety. Before the disaster, luxury liners were marketed heavily around comfort. Elegant dining rooms, private cabins, electricity, fine food, entertainment, speed, modernity. Safety was certainly important, but Titanic demonstrated that passengers also needed to understand emergency procedures. Where are the lifeboats? What happens if an evacuation begins? Where should passengers assemble? What should they bring? How quickly can a ship actually be evacuated? These questions became increasingly important in passenger travel. The modern safety briefing that passengers receive before departure has roots in this broader evolution of maritime safety. The class divide. Titanic also left behind a difficult social lesson. The disaster showed that people did not experience the ship equally. First-class passengers generally had greater access to the upper decks. Third-class passengers were located farther away. Language differences complicated communication. Family members sometimes refused to separate. Some passengers did not understand the emergency until late. And the women and children first principle affected male survival rates dramatically. Titanic therefore became a case study in how social structure can influence survival during a disaster. The ship may have carried everyone across the same ocean. But everyone did not begin the evacuation from the same position. The legacy of the survivors. The survivors carried the disaster with them for the rest of their lives. Some became public figures. Some testified in investigations. Others tried to avoid speaking about Titanic. For many, the event was not an adventure. It was trauma. They had lost parents, children, spouses, friends, colleagues. Entire families disappeared. The historical record often focuses on famous passengers. But thousands of ordinary people were involved. Immigrants traveling toward new lives. Workers earning a living at sea. Families traveling together. Passengers returning home. Titanic's human story was much larger than the names that appeared in newspapers. Titanic and immigration. The disaster also intersected with the enormous movement of people across the Atlantic. In the early 20th century, millions of Europeans were migrating to North America. Ships like Titanic were part of that migration system. For many third-class passengers, the journey was not a luxury experience. It was the beginning of an entirely new life. They were leaving homes behind, crossing the Atlantic, and hoping to build a future in the United States or Canada. For some, Titanic was the final stage of that journey. For others, it became the beginning of a life story marked forever by survival. The shipping industry responds. The disaster also affected the reputation of the White Star Line. The company had to deal with enormous public scrutiny. Titanic's sister ships continued operating, but questions about their safety became unavoidable. The company and the wider shipping industry had to demonstrate that lessons were being learned. Shipowners could no longer assume that passengers would accept minimal lifeboat capacity. Safety became part of public confidence. The disaster had shown what could happen when an emergency exceeded the assumptions built into a ship's design. A new standard of accountability. Titanic also changed public expectations. When a major disaster occurs today, people immediately ask, who was responsible? Were warnings ignored? Were safety rules followed? Was equipment adequate? Were emergency procedures tested? Titanic helped establish this culture of accountability in the maritime world. The investigations showed that disasters should not simply be accepted as acts of fate. They should be studied. Causes should be identified. Systems should be changed. And lessons should be turned into regulations. But could Titanic have been saved? This remains one of the most fascinating questions. If Titanic had slowed down, would she have avoided the iceberg? Possibly. If the iceberg had been spotted earlier, would the ship have turned in time? Possibly. If Titanic had hit the iceberg differently, could she have survived? Possibly. If every lifeboat had been filled to capacity, could hundreds more have survived? Almost certainly more people could have escaped. If Californian had responded, could the death toll have been lower? That remains a matter of historical debate. But there is a critical distinction. We know the outcome. The people aboard Titanic did not. They were making decisions with incomplete information. That is what makes historical judgment difficult. The most important lesson, the deepest lesson of Titanic may not be about ice. It may not even be about ships. It is about assumptions. People assume that a large structure is safe because it is large. They assume that technology is reliable because it is advanced. They assume that regulations are sufficient because authorities approve them. They assume that someone else will respond during an emergency. And they assume that disasters happen to other people. Titanic shattered those assumptions. From Titanic to modern safety. Today, when passengers board a modern ship, they enter a world of safety procedures that would have been unimaginable in 1912. There are emergency drills, dedicated lifeboats and life rafts, modern navigation systems, satellite communications, international safety standards, weather monitoring, ice surveillance, emergency beacons, sophisticated ship design, and far more structured evacuation procedures. None of these systems can guarantee that a ship will never face danger. but they can reduce the likelihood that one mistake or one failure will become a catastrophe. That is the real legacy of Titanic. A disaster that changed the future. Titanic was not the first maritime disaster. And it was certainly not the last. Ships have continued to sink. Fires have occurred. Collisions have happened. Storms have destroyed vessels. But Titanic occupies a unique place in history because the disaster occurred at the intersection of technology, wealth, social class, global communication, and human confidence. The world was changing rapidly in 1912. Titanic represented the changing world. Her sinking revealed its weaknesses. And the reforms that followed helped shape the maritime world that came afterward. But the story does not end with safety. The laws changed. The ships changed. Wireless procedures changed. Ice monitoring changed. Lifeboat requirements changed. Yet Titanic remained a mystery in another sense. The wreck had been found. The investigations had been completed. The safety rules had been rewritten. But the human fascination never disappeared. Why? Because Titanic is not only a story about a ship. It is a story about people. People making decisions under pressure. People believing they were safe. People trying to save strangers. People separated from their families. People facing the possibility of death in the middle of an enormous ocean. And people who survived carrying memories that would last for generations. More than a century later, the name Titanic still produces the same question. How could something that seemed so advanced, so powerful, and so secure disappear in a single night? The answer is not one sentence. It is a chain of engineering limitations, human decisions, environmental conditions, regulatory failures, communication problems, and impossible choices. And when those elements came together on the night of April 14, 1912, Titanic became one of history's most enduring warnings. A warning that the most dangerous moment in human progress is sometimes the moment when people become convinced that they have eliminated danger. More than a century after Titanic disappeared beneath the North Atlantic, the story has become almost impossible to separate from the myths surrounding it. Some stories are supported by evidence. Some are partly true but have been exaggerated. And some became popular only after the disaster, repeated so many times that they eventually sounded like historical fact. That creates a problem for anyone trying to understand Titanic today. Because the real story is already extraordinary. It does not need invented details. The challenge is to separate what we know from what we think we know. And once we do that, Titanic becomes even more fascinating. The unsinkable Titanic. Perhaps the most famous claim is that Titanic was officially called unsinkable. The reality is more complicated. Titanic was widely regarded as exceptionally safe. Her watertight compartments, sophisticated engineering, and enormous size contributed to that reputation. But the idea that the White Star Line formally guaranteed that Titanic could never sink is misleading. The famous image of an absolutely unsinkable ship became much stronger after the disaster. The tragedy itself made the phrase unforgettable. It created a perfect historical contrast. A ship believed to be extraordinarily safe. And a ship lying at the bottom of the Atlantic. But the actual engineering story is more interesting than the myth. Titanic was designed to survive certain flooding scenarios. She was not designed to survive every possible pattern of damage. That distinction would become crucial. Myth number 2, Titanic had a giant hole. Movies and popular illustrations have often shown Titanic suffering a gigantic tear in her side. The reality was different. The iceberg caused damage along the starboard side of the hull, but the destruction was not one enormous opening stretching through the ship. Later investigations and examination of the wreck indicate that the collision produced a series of openings and damaged areas that allowed water into multiple forward compartments. This distinction matters. Titanic did not suddenly fill with water from one enormous hole. The ship flooded progressively. The damage extended far enough forward that too many compartments were compromised. As the bow sank, the design's ability to contain the flooding was overwhelmed. The disaster was therefore not simply iceberg hits ship right pointing arrow giant hole right pointing arrow ship sinks. It was more complicated and more instructive. The watertight compartment myth. Another common misconception is that Titanic's watertight compartments were completely sealed from one another. They were not. The transverse bulkheads divided the lower part of the ship. But the system had limits. The tops of some bulkheads were not high enough to prevent water from eventually spilling over as the ship's bow descended. Think of a series of containers. If one container begins filling, the barrier can keep the water contained. But if the entire structure tilts far enough, water can begin passing over the barrier into the next section. That is broadly what happened as Titanic's bow became increasingly submerged. The ship's subdivision slowed the flooding. It did not make Titanic immune to it. The iceberg wasn't the only problem. This is perhaps the most important lesson. People often describe Titanic's disaster as if the iceberg alone caused everything. But an iceberg by itself does not automatically sink a modern passenger liner. The outcome depended on a combination of factors. The ship's speed, the darkness, the sea conditions, the time available to react, the location and extent of the damage, the number of compartments flooded, the design of the watertight system, and the inability to evacuate everyone. The iceberg was the trigger. The disaster was the result of a chain. Could Titanic have avoided the iceberg? This question has fascinated historians for generations. The answer is probably yes in the broadest sense. If Titanic had never encountered the iceberg, she would not have sunk that night. But the more useful question is, could Titanic have avoided it if the iceberg had been detected earlier or if the ship had reacted differently? Almost certainly, earlier detection would have improved the chances of avoidance. But we cannot know exactly what would have happened. The officers had only seconds. Titanic was traveling at high speed. The iceberg was difficult to see in the dark conditions. And the ship was enormous. Historical analysis can reconstruct probabilities. It cannot recreate the missing seconds. The binocular question. The absence of binoculars in the crow's nest has become one of the most repeated stories about Titanic. The lookouts did not have binoculars available to them when the iceberg was spotted. That is a documented fact. But saying, Titanic sank because the lookouts had no binoculars, goes far beyond the evidence. Binoculars might have helped, but there is no reliable way to prove that they would have allowed the iceberg to be spotted early enough to avoid the collision. The conditions were extraordinarily difficult. The sea was calm. The sky was dark. There was little contrast between the iceberg and the horizon. And the lookouts were relying primarily on their eyes. So the binocular story is important. But it should not be turned into a single cause explanation. The Californian mystery. The story of the Californian remains one of Titanic's most controversial chapters. The ship was in the same general region. Her crew reported seeing rockets. But the ship did not come to Titanic's aid before she sank. Was the crew negligent? Could they have reached Titanic? Did they understand what the rockets meant? These questions were investigated repeatedly. The historical record is complicated. The distance between the ships was not always as straightforward as later popular accounts suggested. The identity of the distant ship seen by Californians' officers has also been debated. The crew did not have modern radar. They were dealing with darkness and ice. And their wireless operator was not on duty at the time Titanic's distress signals were transmitted. The British inquiry criticized the response of Californians' captain. Later historians have continued to examine the evidence. So the responsible conclusion is not simply, Californian watched Titanic sink and did nothing. The real story is more complicated. But the incident unquestionably exposed serious weaknesses in communication and emergency response. The third-class gates. Few Titanic stories have become more emotionally powerful than the claim that third-class passengers were deliberately locked below deck while first-class passengers escaped. This version is often presented as if there were a deliberate conspiracy. The evidence does not support such a simple explanation. There were barriers and controlled passageways aboard Titanic. There were also immigration regulations governing the movement of passengers, particularly in relation to different classes. But the evacuation situation was far more complicated than a single policy of deliberately locking third-class passengers below. Third-class passengers faced disadvantages. They were generally farther from the lifeboat deck. Many did not speak English. They were less familiar with the ship. Some families remained together instead of immediately moving toward the lifeboats. And the evacuation itself was chaotic. These factors contributed to lower survival rates. But that is different from saying that the entire third-class population was intentionally imprisoned below decks. History becomes stronger when we distinguish the documented reality from the dramatic version. The musicians. Another famous part of the Titanic story is the band. According to survivors, the musicians continued playing during the evacuation. This is supported by multiple accounts. But exactly what they played, and in what sequence, has been debated. The famous story that the final song was certainly, "Nearer, my God, to thee," cannot be established with complete certainty. Different survivors remembered different music. That does not make the story meaningless. The important historical fact is that the musicians played during the evacuation. The uncertainty concerns the exact final piece. This is a useful example of how historical memory works. A dramatic detail can become famous while the underlying event remains more complicated. Did Captain Smith go down with the ship? Captain Edward Smith died in the disaster. But the exact circumstances of his final moments are uncertain. There were multiple survivor accounts. Some people claimed to have seen him on or near the bridge. Others gave different descriptions. There is no universally accepted eyewitness account that establishes exactly how he died. This uncertainty is important. Popular culture often gives historical figures clear endings. Real life rarely does. In a disaster involving darkness, freezing water, panic, and thousands of people, many final moments were never witnessed clearly. Did Thomas Andrews really stand alone in the smoking room? Another famous story describes Thomas Andrews standing alone in Titanic's first-class smoking room shortly before the sinking, apparently staring at a painting. The story has been repeated for generations. But its exact details come from survivor testimony and later recollections. Some parts are plausible. Others cannot be established with absolute certainty. What we do know is that Andrews understood the ship was doomed and participated in the evacuation effort. He was reported helping passengers and crew. The broader story is historically important. The exact cinematic image is less certain. That distinction matters. The 3 hours question. Titanic struck the iceberg at approximately 11:40 p.m. She disappeared at approximately 2:20 a.m. The entire sinking therefore lasted roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes. That is extraordinarily long for a ship of Titanic's size. But it was also dangerously short for evacuating more than 2,000 people. The disaster therefore existed in a narrow window. There was enough time to send distress signals. Enough time for lifeboats to leave. Enough time for rescue ships to begin moving. But not enough time for the nearest rescuers to arrive before Titanic sank. This timing became one of the central tragedies. Could everyone have survived? Technically, Titanic had enough lifeboat capacity for approximately 1,178 people. There were more than 2,000 aboard. So even if every lifeboat had been filled completely, not everyone could have survived. But significantly more people could have escaped. Many lifeboats left with fewer passengers than their rated capacity. This means the disaster had two separate problems. First, there were not enough lifeboats. Second, the available capacity was not fully used. Both mattered. The first was a regulatory and design failure. The second was an evacuation failure. Together, they produced catastrophic consequences. Why did people stay aboard? This is one of the hardest questions to understand from a modern perspective. Why would someone refuse a lifeboat when the ship was sinking? Because they did not necessarily believe the ship was going to sink. Titanic remained upright. Her electric lights were still functioning. The decks were still relatively organized. And the lifeboats looked frightening. A small wooden boat on a freezing ocean could appear more dangerous than a massive steel liner. Some passengers therefore preferred to remain aboard. Others were reluctant to separate from husbands or family members. Some did not understand the instructions. And some simply arrived too late. The evacuation was shaped by human psychology as much as by technology. The panic myth. Popular movies often portray Titanic's final minutes as complete chaos. But the historical evidence suggests a more complicated picture. There was fear. There was confusion. There were moments of panic. But there were also long periods when the evacuation remained surprisingly orderly. Crew members continued organizing lifeboats. Passengers waited. Officers maintained discipline. People helped strangers. Some men voluntarily gave up places in lifeboats. Others remained behind because they believed it was their responsibility. The reality was not simply chaos. It was a mixture of courage, fear, confusion, discipline, and individual choices. The role of class. The class system aboard Titanic also needs to be understood carefully. First-class passengers generally had better access to the upper decks. They were closer to the lifeboats. They were more likely to understand the situation earlier. Third-class passengers faced greater physical and informational obstacles. But class was not the only factor. Gender had an enormous influence. Women and children generally received priority. Men were much less likely to survive. Location inside the ship mattered. Family structure mattered. Language mattered. Timing mattered. And individual decisions mattered. Titanic therefore cannot be reduced to one simple formula. The women and children first rule. Another misconception is that there was one universal procedure governing every lifeboat. There was not. Captain Smith instructed officers to give women and children priority. But the two senior deck officers interpreted and applied the principle differently. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was stricter. First Officer William Murdoch generally allowed men to enter if women and children had already been accommodated and seats remained. This contributed to different survival patterns on different sides of the ship. The phrase, "women and children first," sounds simple. In practice, it became a series of individual decisions. And those decisions affected who lived. Was Titanic traveling too fast? The British inquiry concluded that Titanic was traveling too quickly considering the ice conditions. Modern historians continue to debate how much speed contributed to the disaster. There is little doubt that speed reduced the time available for reaction. But speed alone did not guarantee collision. A ship traveling quickly can avoid an iceberg if it sees it early enough. A slower ship can still collide with an iceberg if detection occurs too late. The important lesson is the relationship between speed, visibility, and stopping or turning distance. Titanic's speed increased the consequences of late detection. It did not independently create the iceberg. The switched ships theory. One of the strangest Titanic theories claims that Titanic was secretly switched with her older sister Olympic as part of an insurance scheme. The theory suggests that the damaged Olympic was disguised as Titanic and deliberately sunk. It sounds dramatic, but the evidence does not support it. The ships were similar, but they were not identical in every detail. There are extensive records documenting Titanic's construction, fitting out, ownership, and voyage. The financial and logistical requirements of secretly switching two enormous ocean liners would have been extraordinary. And the wreck itself corresponds to Titanic. The theory survives because it is mysterious, not because the evidence makes it convincing. The coal fire theory. Another claim suggests that a coal bunker fire weakened Titanic's hull and contributed significantly to the sinking. Titanic did have a coal fire in one of her bunkers. Coal fires were not unusual on steamships. The fire was managed by the crew. Some researchers have argued that heat may have weakened steel or affected the surrounding structure. But the claim that the coal fire was the primary cause of Titanic's loss is not established. The collision with the iceberg remains the central cause. The fire is better understood as a possible contributing factor that has been studied rather than a proven alternative explanation. The Olympic connection. Titanic's sister ship, Olympic, survived for many years after Titanic's disaster. The two ships were built as part of the same Olympic-class series. Their similarities have sometimes fueled speculation. But the survival of Olympic is actually useful historical evidence. It demonstrates that the basic class of ship was not inherently doomed. The disaster resulted from a specific combination of circumstances. Titanic encountered an iceberg. Olympic did not experience the same sequence of events. This is an important reminder. A ship can be extremely advanced and still have vulnerabilities. But one disaster does not automatically prove that an entire design was fundamentally defective. What the wreck confirmed. The discovery of Titanic in 1985 helped settle several questions. The ship was found in two major sections. The bow and stern were separated. The stern was severely damaged. A large debris field surrounded the wreck. The ship had clearly undergone enormous structural forces during the sinking. The wreck also provided evidence about the condition of the hull and the location of structural damage. But even the wreck cannot answer every question. History still depends on multiple sources. The iceberg itself. Another popular image shows Titanic hitting an enormous mountain of ice. The actual iceberg that Titanic struck was never photographed with certainty. There were reports of icebergs in the region. A photograph later became famous as the possible iceberg that had caused Titanic's destruction, but identifying it with certainty is difficult. The iceberg itself was not preserved as evidence. It drifted away, melted, disappeared. Only the consequences remained. This is another reminder of how much Titanic history depends on reconstructing an event from incomplete evidence. Why Titanic still matters. The reason Titanic remains famous is not simply because she was large. Many ships have been larger. Many disasters have killed more people. Many modern ships are far more technologically advanced. Titanic remains unique because the story contains nearly every element of a great historical tragedy. Ambition, technology, wealth, immigration, social class, human confidence, natural forces, communication, courage, failure, and loss. It is a story in which the smallest decisions can become historically enormous. The real Titanic is more powerful than the myth. When the myths are removed, Titanic does not become less interesting. She becomes more interesting. The real story is not about a magical curse. Not about an evil conspiracy. Not about a ship that was literally guaranteed never to sink. It is about a highly advanced ship operating within the limitations of its time. It is about people who made decisions with incomplete information. It is about regulations that had not kept pace with technology. It is about an emergency system that was not prepared for the scale of the disaster. And it is about how one night exposed weaknesses across an entire industry. The final lesson: Titanic did not prove that technology was useless. She proved that technology without humility can become dangerous. A ship can be stronger than anything built before it. A communication system can be revolutionary. A crew can be highly trained. A company can follow the regulations. And yet a disaster can still happen. The answer is not to stop building. It is to understand the limits of what has been built. That is perhaps Titanic's greatest legacy. Not the idea that humans should fear technology, but the idea that humans should never confuse technological achievement with absolute safety. Titanic disappeared in 1912. The wreck was found in 1985. But the questions surrounding her have continued for more than a century. Some mysteries have been solved. Others remain uncertain. And some stories will probably never be completely separated from the mythology that grew around them. But one thing is certain. The real Titanic was already extraordinary. She did not need a conspiracy. She did not need a curse. She did not need an invented mystery. The facts were enough. A ship built to represent the confidence of an age encountered an environment it could not completely control. And in less than 3 hours, that confidence sank with her. Titanic's story is often told through the ship. The enormous hull, the iceberg, the lifeboats, the wreck lying thousands of feet below the Atlantic. But the ship was never the true heart of the story. The heart of Titanic was the people. More than 2,000 individuals boarded that ship with their own reasons for crossing the Atlantic. Some were wealthy. Some were traveling for business. Some were immigrants beginning completely new lives. Some were workers who had spent their careers at sea. Some were children traveling with their parents. And some believed Titanic was simply the safest way to reach the other side of the ocean. By the morning of April 15, 1912, more than 1,500 of those people were dead. Around 700 survived. But surviving Titanic did not mean the story was over. For many survivors, the sinking followed them for the rest of their lives. The survivors reached New York. When Carpathia finally reached New York, enormous crowds gathered. People had been waiting for news. Families stood on the docks hoping to see someone they loved. Others had already learned that their relatives were missing. The arrival of Carpathia became one of the most emotional moments in the aftermath of the disaster. The survivors stepped onto land carrying almost nothing. Some had lost everything they owned. Others had lost parents, spouses, children, siblings, or friends. Some survivors did not even know who in their families had escaped. For them, the journey to New York was not a triumphant return. It was the beginning of grief. The names on the list. As the survivors were identified, another process began. The names of the dead were compiled. Newspapers published lists. Families searched for information. Telegrams crossed continents. People waited for confirmation. For those who had relatives aboard Titanic, uncertainty could be almost as painful as the truth. A passenger might simply be listed as missing. Days could pass before a family knew whether that person had survived. The disaster therefore continued long after the ship disappeared. Its consequences moved from the Atlantic Ocean into homes around the world. The wealthy passengers. Titanic carried some extraordinarily wealthy passengers. Among them were businessmen, industrialists, and members of prominent families. Their deaths attracted enormous media attention. Newspapers published stories about their fortunes, their families, their final hours, their possessions, their decisions during the evacuation. But focusing only on the wealthy can distort the story. Titanic was not simply a floating gathering of millionaires. The overwhelming majority of people aboard were ordinary human beings. Workers, immigrants, crew members, families, children, people whose names rarely appeared in the international press. Their stories were just as real. The immigrants. For many third-class passengers, Titanic represented something completely different. It was not a luxury experience. It was a passage toward a new life. They were leaving Europe. Some were heading toward relatives already living in America. Others hoped to find work. Some were traveling with entire families. They had sold possessions, said goodbye to friends, left behind familiar towns, and crossed the Atlantic believing that a new future was waiting. For many, that future ended in the North Atlantic. For the survivors, however, the dream of immigration continued. Some eventually reached the United States. Others changed their plans, and some returned to Europe. The children of Titanic. Among the most heartbreaking stories are those of children who survived. Some escaped with their mothers. Some were separated from their fathers. Some lost both parents. The disaster forced children into circumstances that no child should ever have experienced. Few became symbols of Titanic in later years. But many others disappeared into ordinary life. Their stories remind us that history is not made only by famous people. A child who survived Titanic could later live a completely ordinary life. But that person would always carry one extraordinary event in their past. The men who stayed behind. The survival statistics reveal one of the clearest features of the disaster. Men were far less likely to survive than women and children. This was largely the result of the evacuation system and the principle of giving women and children priority. Many men stepped aside. Some accompanied their families to the lifeboats and then remained aboard. Others were unable to reach a lifeboat in time. Some may have believed that another boat would be available. Others simply accepted the expectation that they should remain behind. The result was devastating. Hundreds of fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers never returned. The crew suffered an enormous loss. Titanic required hundreds of people to operate. Engineers, firemen, stokers, stewards, cooks, deck officers, wireless operators, waiters, bellboys, and countless others. Many remained aboard while passengers were evacuated. Their survival rate was dramatically lower than that of first-class women and children. For the crew, Titanic was not simply a journey. It was their workplace. They were responsible for keeping the ship functioning. During the disaster, many continued performing their duties long after it became clear that the ship could not be saved. The engine room. The men working deep inside Titanic's machinery spaces faced one of the least visible parts of the disaster. They worked below decks while water entered the forward sections. Engineers and other crew members continued attempting to maintain electrical power and machinery. Their work mattered because electricity was essential for communication and evacuation. Keeping the lights on gave the crew more time. Keeping systems functioning allowed wireless operators to continue sending messages. These men were far from the lifeboat deck. Many never had a realistic chance to escape. Their contribution is often overshadowed by the famous images of passengers on the upper decks. But Titanic could not have functioned without them. Jack Phillips. Wireless operator Jack Phillips became one of the best-known crew members after the disaster. He continued transmitting distress messages as Titanic sank. His work helped bring Carpathia toward the survivors. Phillips did not survive. His story became a powerful example of duty under extreme circumstances. But it also demonstrates how dangerous the wireless room had become. The operators were not simply sitting at a desk. They were working while the ship was dying around them. Their messages were one of Titanic's final links to the outside world. Harold Bride. Harold Bride survived. His testimony became important to understanding the final hours. He described the wireless operation and the desperate conditions aboard Titanic. Bride's survival allowed investigators to hear directly from someone who had remained close to the wireless room until the final stage. His account helped preserve information about what happened during those final moments. But like every eyewitness account, it had to be considered alongside the testimony of others. That is how historical reconstruction works. No single survivor saw everything. The band members, the musicians became another enduring part of Titanic's memory. They were not passengers simply entertaining themselves. They were working professionals. During the evacuation, they continued playing. Their decision became symbolic because music offered a sense of calm while everything around them was collapsing. But there is another side to their story. Every musician aboard Titanic died. They had remained at their posts while passengers were being evacuated. Their final actions became one of the most remembered examples of duty during the disaster. A different kind of courage. Titanic produced stories of courage that were not always dramatic. A person giving up a seat. A father helping his family reach a lifeboat. A crew member carrying instructions between decks. A stranger helping another passenger. A wireless operator continuing to transmit. A steward guiding people toward the boats. These actions may seem small compared with the sinking of a giant ship. But disasters are experienced through individual decisions. Titanic's legacy is therefore filled with thousands of moments that were never recorded. Some were acts of courage. Some were acts of fear. Some were acts of confusion. And some were simply people trying to survive. The survivors' memories. After the disaster, survivors became sources of historical evidence. Investigators needed them. Journalists wanted them. Authors interviewed them. Researchers later returned to their testimony. But memory changes. A person who experiences a traumatic event does not necessarily remember every detail perfectly. Different survivors remembered the same moments differently. Some accounts changed over time. Some details became clearer. Others became uncertain. This does not mean survivors were lying. It means eyewitness testimony has limitations. Historians therefore compare survivor accounts with documents, technical evidence, and other independent sources. That process helps separate memory from fact. The burden of survival. For some survivors, living through Titanic created a complicated emotional burden. They had survived. Others had not. Some survivors had escaped in lifeboats while people they knew remained aboard. They could hear cries from the water. They could see Titanic disappear. Then they had to live with the knowledge that they were alive when others were not. Survival can produce guilt. Not everyone experienced it in the same way. But for some, the question remained. Why did I live when someone else did not? That question cannot be answered by statistics. The survivors returned to ordinary life. Eventually, the survivors had to continue living. They needed homes, jobs, families, children, daily routines. The world moved forward, but Titanic remained part of their identity. Some survivors spoke publicly. Some avoided interviews. Some rarely discussed the event. Others participated in Titanic commemorations. As the years passed, their numbers gradually declined. The generation that had actually experienced the disaster began disappearing. And with each death, another direct connection to Titanic was lost. The last survivors. The final surviving passengers lived for many decades after the disaster. One of the last survivors, Milvina Dean, was only a baby when Titanic sank. She died in 2009, at the age of 97. She had no conscious memory of the sinking itself. Yet she became one of Titanic's most recognizable living connections. Her story demonstrates something remarkable. Titanic survived not only through eyewitnesses who remembered the night. It survived through people who were too young to remember but whose lives were permanently connected to it. Titanic enters popular culture. As the years passed, Titanic became more than a historical event. It became part of popular culture. Books were written. Films were produced. Songs were composed. Museums displayed artifacts. Exhibitions traveled around the world. The ship appeared in documentaries and fictional stories. Every generation discovered Titanic again. But popularity came with a cost. The more the story entered popular culture, the more historical fact became mixed with dramatic invention. Characters were simplified. Events were rearranged. Some stories were exaggerated. And some myths became so familiar that people assumed they were facts. The 1997 film. The most influential modern retelling was James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic. The film introduced the disaster to an enormous global audience. Its fictional central love story was not a historical account. Jack Dawson and Rose DeWitt Bukater were fictional characters. But the film placed those fictional characters within a carefully researched historical environment. The ship, the interiors, the lifeboats, the sinking, the class system, and many real historical figures were recreated. The result helped establish Titanic as one of the most recognizable stories in modern popular culture. But it is important to distinguish the movie from the historical record. The emotional story may be fictional. The disaster surrounding it was real. Why the story continues to work. There is a reason Titanic continues to attract audiences more than a century later. The story contains a powerful contradiction. A ship representing human confidence meets a force of nature. A world of luxury collides with extreme vulnerability. People surrounded by wealth discover that money cannot buy safety. A massive steel structure becomes helpless in the middle of the ocean. And ordinary human decisions suddenly determine life and death. That combination makes Titanic more than a shipwreck. It makes it a story about human existence. The class question never disappears. Titanic continues to generate debate about inequality. The first-class passengers had luxurious surroundings. The third-class passengers traveled under very different conditions. The crew lived and worked in an entirely different world again. Yet when the ship sank, these social divisions became complicated. The lifeboat system did not distribute survival equally. Gender and class influenced access. Location mattered. Language mattered. Information mattered. Money could provide a better cabin. It could not guarantee a lifeboat seat. Titanic therefore became one of the clearest historical examples of how social inequality can shape the experience of disaster. The human stories behind the numbers. It is easy to say. More than 1,500 people died. But numbers hide individual lives. One passenger was someone's father. Another was someone's daughter. One was a newlywed. Another was traveling to meet family. Another was trying to find work. Another had spent years serving aboard ships. Another was only a child. When historians reconstruct Titanic, these individual stories give meaning to the statistics. The disaster was not a number. It was thousands of separate lives interrupted at the same time. The artifacts. As expeditions reached the wreck, objects began revealing pieces of those lives. Suitcases, shoes, dishes, personal items, pieces of furniture, ship equipment. The objects were sometimes remarkably ordinary. And that was precisely what made them powerful. A shoe lying on the seabed is not impressive because of its material value. It is powerful because someone once wore it. Someone walked aboard Titanic wearing it. Someone packed luggage. Someone ate from a plate. Someone sat in a chair. Someone expected to arrive in New York. Then the ship sank. The object remained. The ethical question, but should these objects be recovered? That question has never been simple. Supporters argue that artifacts can be preserved, studied, and displayed so future generations can understand Titanic. Opponents argue that the wreck is a grave site and should be left undisturbed. Both perspectives are rooted in genuine concerns. Scientific research can reveal history. But Titanic is also the final resting place of more than 1,000 people. That is why modern expeditions face ethical and legal questions that did not exist when the wreck was first discovered. Titanic is a memorial. Over time, Titanic has become a memorial as much as a historical subject. Memorials have been created. Names have been preserved. Museums have displayed artifacts. Families have maintained records. Researchers have documented the lives of passengers and crew. The purpose is not simply to remember the ship. It is to remember the people. Because the most important thing at the bottom of the Atlantic is not the steel. It is the human history attached to it. The story passes to a new generation. Today, nobody who consciously remembered Titanic's sinking remains alive. The final direct witnesses are gone. That changes the nature of the story. For more than a century, Titanic could still be connected to living memory. Now it belongs entirely to history. Researchers must rely on documents, recorded testimony, photographs, artifacts, the wreck, and the memories preserved by earlier generations. The responsibility has shifted. The people who experienced Titanic can no longer correct our mistakes. We have to do that ourselves. What should we remember? Should we remember Titanic as a technological failure? As a story of class inequality? As an example of human courage? As a maritime disaster? As a warning about arrogance? As a memorial to more than 1,500 dead? The answer is all of these. Titanic cannot be reduced to one lesson. That is why the story has survived. Different generations see different meanings in it. Engineers see design limitations. Historians see a changing world. Social historians see class and gender. Maritime experts see failures in safety systems. Families see personal loss. And ordinary viewers see a human tragedy that still feels strangely immediate. More than a century later, the Atlantic has changed little since 1912. The water is still cold. Icebergs still form. The ocean is still enormous. And Titanic still rests on the seabed. But the world around the wreck has transformed. Modern ships have satellite communications, advanced navigation, Sophisticated weather information, international safety standards, emergency equipment, and evacuation procedures developed from more than a century of experience. The lessons of Titanic are built into systems that most passengers never think about. That may be the most meaningful legacy of all. The best safety lesson is often the one people no longer notice. The memory of the night. At approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, Titanic disappeared. For the people aboard, the event ended their ordinary lives. For the survivors, it became a memory. For governments, it became a warning. For engineers, it became a case study. For historians, it became an enormous archive. And for the public, it became a legend. But beneath the legend is something much simpler. Thousands of people boarded a ship expecting to arrive safely. They had plans. They had families. They had hopes. They believed they were traveling toward a future. Only a few days later, their lives had become part of history. And perhaps that is why Titanic continues to matter. Not because she was the biggest. Not because she was the most luxurious. Not because she was truly unsinkable. But because her story forces us to confront something universal. Human beings build. Human beings trust. Human beings make decisions. And sometimes, despite all our technology and preparation, we discover how little control we actually have. Titanic disappeared into the darkness. But her passengers did not disappear from history. Their names remain. Their stories remain. Their lessons remain. And the ship itself remains beneath the Atlantic, slowly disappearing piece by piece. The question now is not whether Titanic will eventually vanish. She will. The question is, what will remain when the wreck is finally gone? The answer is the legacy. The laws. The memories. The evidence. And the story. More than a century has passed since Titanic vanished into the North Atlantic. The people who stood on her decks are gone. The officers who tried to save her are gone. The survivors who carried the memories of that night are gone. Even the ship itself is slowly being reclaimed by the ocean. And yet Titanic has never truly disappeared. Her name remains instantly recognizable. Her story has been told in books, films, documentaries, museums, memorials, classrooms, and countless conversations. But why? Why has this particular ship remained so powerful in the human imagination? The answer goes far beyond the sinking itself. Titanic became a symbol of ambition, a symbol of technological confidence, a symbol of inequality, a symbol of human courage, and above all, a symbol of the limits of human control. The world that built Titanic. To understand Titanic's legacy, we have to return briefly to the world that created her. The early 20th century was an age of extraordinary confidence. Factories were expanding, cities were growing, railroads connected continents, electricity was transforming daily life, telephones were spreading, automobiles were becoming increasingly common. And across the Atlantic, enormous passenger liners connected Europe and North America. The future seemed to be arriving faster than anyone had imagined. Titanic belonged perfectly to that world. She was not merely a ship. She was a statement that engineering could make the ocean faster, safer, and more comfortable. Her enormous size reflected the industrial ambitions of the age. Her luxurious interiors reflected the wealth of the passengers she carried. Her technology reflected the belief that the modern world was becoming increasingly controllable. Then came the iceberg, the collision that became a symbol. The physical event was brutally simple. An iceberg, a ship, a collision, flooding, evacuation, sinking. But history rarely remembers events only for what physically happened. It remembers what those events came to represent. Titanic became a warning against excessive confidence. Not because confidence itself is dangerous. Human progress requires confidence. Engineers must believe they can build something that has never existed. Explorers must believe they can go somewhere unknown. Scientists must believe that unanswered questions can be solved. The danger comes when confidence turns into certainty. When people stop asking, what could go wrong? Titanic forced that question back into the center of modern thinking. The ocean does not care about status. Titanic also created one of the most powerful contrasts in modern history. On board were people from radically different social worlds. Some lived in extraordinary luxury. Others were traveling in third class. Some were members of wealthy industrial families. Others were workers and immigrants hoping for a new beginning. The ship contained restaurants, elegant lounges, expensive suites, crew quarters, machinery spaces, and cramped passenger accommodations. It was almost a miniature society. But the ocean outside recognized none of those distinctions. An iceberg did not care who was rich. The freezing water did not care who had a first-class ticket. The ship's sinking demonstrated that social status could influence someone's position and access to safety, but it could not guarantee survival. That is one reason Titanic continues to be discussed whenever historians examine class and inequality. The people who never became famous. The famous names are easy to remember. But most Titanic passengers were not famous. They did not own enormous businesses. They did not appear regularly in newspapers. They were not powerful political figures. They were ordinary people, and many of them left behind almost no historical record beyond a passenger list, a photograph, or a family document. That creates a challenge for historians. How do you reconstruct the life of someone who left behind only a name? Sometimes the answer is found in fragments. A birth certificate, an immigration record, a letter, a newspaper notice, a photograph, a family memory, a grave. Piece by piece, the individual emerges from the statistics. And suddenly the number becomes a person. Titanic and the immigrant dream. For immigrants aboard Titanic, the disaster carried an especially painful meaning. Many were traveling toward North America because they believed a different future was possible. They were leaving behind familiar communities. Some had relatives waiting for them. Some were looking for work. Some were planning marriages. Some hoped to send money home. Their journey was part of one of the greatest movements of people in modern history. Titanic became part of that larger immigration story. For those who survived, the dream continued. For those who died, the journey ended only miles from the future they had imagined. The families left behind. The consequences of Titanic were not limited to the passengers. They reached families across Europe and North America. A husband did not return. A father disappeared. A daughter never arrived. A son who had promised to write home was suddenly gone. The economic consequences could also be severe. Many families depended on the income of the person who had been aboard. The loss of a wage earner could push a family into financial difficulty. So Titanic was not only a maritime disaster. It was thousands of personal disasters unfolding simultaneously. The changes in maritime safety. Perhaps the most concrete legacy of Titanic is the transformation of maritime safety. The disaster helped drive stronger international standards. Lifeboat requirements became more demanding. Wireless communication became more closely integrated into emergency procedures. Continuous radio watch became an important principle. Ice monitoring became more organized. International cooperation became increasingly important. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, became one of the central frameworks for maritime safety. The first SOLAS convention was adopted in 1914. Later versions were developed as technology and maritime practices changed. Today, SOLAS remains a cornerstone of international ship safety. Titanic did not create the entire modern safety system, but the disaster became one of the major forces pushing that system forward. The International Ice Patrol. Among the most direct legacies is the International Ice Patrol. Its mission is simple: monitor ice in the North Atlantic and warn ships about dangerous conditions. That concept represents an important change in human behavior. Instead of simply reacting to disasters, authorities began investing more heavily in prevention. Observe the environment, collect information, share warnings, reduce risk. That approach became fundamental to modern transportation safety. Titanic demonstrated what could happen when dangerous information existed but was not transformed into an effective system of prevention. From wireless to the modern world, Titanic's wireless operators were among the final links between the ship and the outside world. Their distress messages brought help. But the disaster exposed weaknesses in wireless communication practices. Over time, emergency communication became increasingly standardized. Today, ships can use technologies that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the people aboard Titanic. Satellite communications, digital navigation, emergency beacons, automated identification systems, modern weather information. These systems do not make ships invulnerable, but they make isolation far less absolute. In 1912, the ocean could separate a ship from the world. Today, communication technology has dramatically reduced that isolation. The wreck, For more than 7 decades, Titanic remained hidden beneath the Atlantic. Then, in 1985, the wreck was located. The discovery changed Titanic history forever. Suddenly, the ship was no longer only a collection of documents, photographs, memories, and survivor accounts. There was physical evidence. A real wreck. A real location. A structure resting on the ocean floor. The discovery allowed researchers to study Titanic in ways that had previously been impossible. But it also created new questions. How should the wreck be treated? Should artifacts be recovered? Should the site remain untouched? Who owns what lies beneath the ocean? And perhaps most importantly, is Titanic a historical artifact, or a maritime grave? A grave beneath the Atlantic. More than 1,500 people died when Titanic sank. Their remains were not recovered. The wreck therefore occupies a special place in maritime history. For some, exploring Titanic is a form of archaeology. For others, entering the wreck site feels like disturbing a grave. That tension has never completely disappeared. Modern expeditions must balance scientific research against respect for the dead. And as technology makes deeper exploration possible, the ethical questions become more important, not less. The wreck is dying. There is another remarkable fact. Titanic is not going to remain preserved forever. The ship is being slowly destroyed by the environment. Saltwater corrodes metal. Microorganisms interact with the wreck. Structural components weaken. Sections collapse. The wreck is changing year by year. Eventually, much of the ship will disappear. The Titanic that exists today is not exactly the Titanic discovered in 1985. It is a changing archaeological site. And someday, the physical structure will be dramatically reduced. That means the historical record becomes even more important. The steel will disappear. The story will not. Why we keep returning to Titanic. Every generation seems to rediscover Titanic. Children learn the story. Adults revisit it. Researchers publish new findings. Documentaries examine old evidence from new perspectives. Expeditions return to the wreck. Why? Because Titanic raises questions that remain relevant. How do humans respond when technology fails? How should governments regulate dangerous industries? How should emergency systems be designed? What happens when social inequality meets disaster? How reliable is eyewitness memory? How much should we trust technology? And perhaps the biggest question: how much control do we really have over the world around us? Titanic and human arrogance. The word, arrogance, is often used when discussing Titanic. But we should be careful. The people who built Titanic were not necessarily arrogant fools. They were highly skilled engineers and workers. They achieved something extraordinary. The problem was not that they believed in engineering. The problem was that the systems surrounding the ship had not fully adapted to the possibilities created by that engineering. Technology had advanced faster than some regulations. Ships had become larger faster than evacuation requirements. Wireless communication had advanced faster than international procedures. Titanic revealed what happens when one part of a system evolves faster than the others. That is a lesson that remains relevant today. The modern world has its own Titanics. Today, we live in an even more technologically dependent world. Aircraft cross oceans in hours. Massive container ships move global trade. Nuclear power plants produce electricity. Millions of people travel through airports every day. Computers control critical infrastructure. Satellites guide navigation. Artificial intelligence is increasingly involved in decision-making. We trust these systems because they usually work. But Titanic reminds us that reliability should never be confused with perfection. Every complex system contains weaknesses. The challenge is finding them before catastrophe does. The importance of redundancy. One of the greatest lessons of Titanic is the importance of backup systems. If one system fails, another should be available. If communication fails, another method should exist. If one evacuation route is blocked, another should remain open. If one component is damaged, the entire system should not collapse. Modern safety engineering relies heavily on redundancy. That philosophy was not born entirely from Titanic. But Titanic became a powerful historical example of why redundancy matters. The safest system is rarely the one where everything works perfectly. It is the one designed to remain functional when something goes wrong. Titanic's legacy in engineering. Engineers study disasters because failure can reveal weaknesses that success hides. A successful voyage does not necessarily prove that a design is perfect. It may simply mean that the dangerous conditions never occurred. Titanic encountered an extreme combination of circumstances. The result exposed weaknesses that had previously remained theoretical. That is why disasters are studied so carefully. Not to glorify tragedy, but to prevent repetition. Every improved regulation carries a piece of history inside it. Somewhere behind the rule is usually an earlier failure. And behind many maritime safety rules stands Titanic. The power of historical memory. There is another reason Titanic matters. History is not simply about remembering dates. It is about deciding what lessons deserve to survive. The sinking happened in 1912. But the questions it raised remain alive. What is acceptable risk? Who is responsible when a system fails? How much preparation is enough? How should emergency resources be distributed? How should technology be regulated? How should we balance economic competition against safety? These questions do not belong only to the past. They belong to every generation. What Titanic teaches about disaster. A disaster rarely has one cause. Titanic was not simply an iceberg. It was a chain. Warnings, speed, visibility, human judgment, ship design, evacuation capacity, communication, emergency response, and the environment. Remove one part of that chain and the outcome might have changed. That is one of the most important lessons modern safety experts have taken from disasters. Do not search only for one person to blame. Search for the system. Find the weaknesses. Find the conditions that allowed those weaknesses to combine. Then change the system. The ship that became a warning. Titanic began as a symbol of what humanity could build. After her sinking, she became a symbol of what humanity could fail to anticipate. That transformation is what gives the story its extraordinary power. The ship did not become meaningless because she sank. Her meaning changed. Before April 1912, Titanic represented possibility. After April 1912, Titanic represented consequence. The lasting human story. But there is one final point that should never be forgotten. Titanic was not built to become a legend. The people who boarded her were not characters in a historical story. They were living their lives. They were traveling, working, reuniting with relatives, searching for opportunity, returning home, starting over. They did not know they were participating in one of the most famous events in modern history. That is what makes the story so haunting. History often begins as ordinary life. Nobody knows which ordinary morning will become a date remembered forever. Nobody knows which journey will become a final journey. Nobody knows which photograph will become an historical document. The last night. Imagine the North Atlantic in the early hours of April 15th. The ship is gone. The lifeboats are scattered across the darkness. Hundreds of people are waiting for rescue. The ocean is almost unimaginably large. The passengers who survived do not yet know what the future will bring. They do not know how long they will wait. They do not know who else has survived. They do not know what the newspapers will say. They do not know that their names will be remembered more than a century later. For them, there is only the darkness. And the waiting. Then, eventually, a light appears. Carpathia. Rescue. Land. But for thousands of families, there would be no rescue. Only confirmation of loss. More than a ship. That is why Titanic should not be remembered merely as a famous shipwreck. She was a crossroads. Between old maritime traditions and modern safety systems. Between industrial ambition and environmental reality. Between social privilege and human vulnerability. Between technological confidence and uncertainty. And between ordinary life and historical memory. Her story belongs simultaneously to engineering, politics, immigration, social history, maritime history, and human psychology. That is why it refuses to disappear. The final question, perhaps the most important question, is not, why did Titanic sink? We know broadly why she sank. The more important question is, what did humanity learn from her? We learned that regulations must evolve with technology. We learned that emergency capacity matters. We learned that communication systems must be reliable. We learned that warnings must lead to action. We learned that disasters are rarely caused by one failure. And we learned that confidence must always be balanced by preparation. The legacy. Titanic rests beneath the Atlantic. Her steel is slowly disappearing. Her decks have collapsed. Her interiors are being consumed by time and the ocean. But her legacy is moving in the opposite direction. It is expanding. Every safety regulation influenced by the disaster carries part of her history. Every maritime professional who studies the sinking encounters her lessons. Every museum visitor who reads the names encounters her human story. Every documentary that separates fact from myth keeps the historical record alive. And every generation that asks what went wrong keeps the memory from becoming meaningless. Epilogue: the ship that refused to disappear. Titanic sailed into history believing she was carrying people toward the future. Instead, she became part of the past. But perhaps that is not the tragedy's final meaning. Because the people who died did not disappear completely. Their names survived. Their stories survived. Their families preserved memories. Their belongings became evidence. Their disaster changed international maritime safety. And their final journey changed the way the world thought about technological confidence. Titanic was lost in the Atlantic. But the lessons of Titanic traveled everywhere. Across oceans. Across generations. Across industries. And across time. More than 100 years later, we can still look at the photographs. We can still read the passenger lists. We can still study the testimony. We can still examine the wreck. We can still ask questions. And perhaps that is the greatest tribute we can give the people aboard Titanic. Not to turn their deaths into a myth. Not to invent mysteries where evidence does not exist. Not to romanticize the disaster. But to remember what actually happened. To remember the people. To understand the failures. And to carry the lessons forward. Because Titanic's greatest warning was never that a ship could sink. Everyone already knew ships could sink. The real warning was far more uncomfortable. Even the most advanced system can fail when human beings believe its limits have already been conquered. Titanic proved that the ocean could still defeat the greatest achievements of the industrial age. But humanity did not emerge from the disaster empty-handed. We carried its lessons into the future. We built stronger rules, better communication, better monitoring, better emergency procedures, and a deeper understanding of risk. The ship is still beneath the Atlantic. The people who witnessed her final night are gone. The world that built her has disappeared. But the question Titanic left behind is still with us. When we build something powerful enough to change the world, are we also prepared for the moment when it fails? That question has no final answer. And perhaps that is why Titanic still haunts the world. Not because she was unsinkable, but because she was human. If you enjoyed this documentary, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories from history. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next documentary.